Hello, beautiful people. Thank you for joining us today, this evening, today, whatever time it might be, wherever you happen to be. I am joined by Mr. Panama Hat, and very pleased that it is so. The subject of our discussion this time for this video, for this live stream, will be the lives of poets. We will doubtless cover some of their poems as well, but I thought it would be interesting to take a look at how they lived, whether or not there could or would or even should be any kind of patterns in their lives, whether or not there are any archetypes operating. And in any case, it would be interesting, I thought, to look at the lives of some few of them that stand out for me, that are interesting. And I expect that Panama Hat has some poets in mind as well. And obviously, he's a perfect fit for a discussion of this sort, being quite interested in poetry himself, having written and published poems. So I'm very, very happy that he was able to join us. You will note down below links for his Twitter, also for his YouTube channel. Before we get started, before we jump into this discussion, before I allow Panama Hat to do any opening shills he might wish to undertake, I should say, please do follow this channel, Semigog, as well as A Safer Space. You can do that on BitChute. You can do that over on what's it called, Odyssey, as well as on YouTube itself. There's Telegram, where you can find me. There is Twitter. There's Gab. I think I might even have a Minds account still. Yeah, so please do follow me in those various places. I want to thank the Praetorian Chads that make this possible, those who support the channel. You saw their names on the roll of honor in the opening animation. And please do consider purchasing my science fiction novella and perhaps even my own collection of poems, which you can find on both of which you can find on Amazon. There are links in the description below. And it just occurred to me that I did not include a link for Hat's poetic publication. So I'll just, my apologies. I'll add that as soon as we're done with this stream, Hat. And in any case, thank you very much for coming on. You are the perfect guest. Please say hello to everyone. Introduce yourself, shill whatever you like, and let's kick this thing off, sir.
Yes, well, good evening from Wales. I mean, you've more or less done all the shilling for me. The only upcoming thing I have to point out is on Saturday evening, about 8 o'clock, I'll be appearing on Mr. Nathan C.J. Hood's channel to discuss Wagner and total art, basically. Which, to be honest, I don't know if that's going to be so much about Wagner, because but more about sort of total art and how he was kind of a practitioner of it. The kind of blending of lyric and sound and visuals and so forth in his operas, which of course he was very famous for. And yeah, I mean, I it's annoying because I have so many things in the works right now. Books of every description, poetry collections, both comic and serious, possibly some collaborations with publishers in the dissident sphere in the upcoming weeks. But I can't really put a date or a definitive stamp on any of it yet, so it has to wait. So that's just kind of a watch this space. Also, I have to say, I adore the way that you always put such a lovely southern twang on Panama. Panama Hat. I like that.
How should I say it?
No, that is good. I like it.
Should it be Panama?
No. We're not
it's
doing
the maw, the gaping maw.
Panama.
The maw of Panama.
You give it such an earthy sound. It's good.
Yes.
Like
my paternal grandparents met in Panama, and
really,
yes, and they had to leave when World War II broke out.
Was there any particular reason they were there, or
they were there in the canal zone? I think
right,
my paternal grandmother was working as I can't remember, a school teacher, maybe. in the Canal Zone, and yeah, grandfather was probably selling insurance. They came from New Orleans, and so the whole sort of Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, that whole region was sort of their purview. Back in those days, New Orleans was more connected to Central America and the rest.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes.
Well, but I mean, not to get too far off topic, but people want to look into the story of the construction of the Panama Canal and how America basically just bribed the province of Colombia to declare independence so they could build it. It's a very interesting story. People want to look into that.
Yes, some craziness. Yeah, and
very
lots
crazy.
of people, dropping dead from fever. Yeah, all kinds of madness and insanity. Dave Martell is a friend of the channel, a guest who's been here in the past. He's asking us to read some of our poems, perhaps at the end.
Possibly.
Yes.
I have a real loathing of reading my own work. But perhaps we can try. Also, hasn't Mr. Martell didn't he super chat on UO the other night that he's recently published a book?
Yes, it does seem that he's just published a book of his own poetry.
Well, please link that to us, Mr. Martell, because one of my my main project for this sort of dissidence theory as a whole is to sort of comb through and find the really good potential artists, writers, etc. And I want to kind of build up a small academy of poets and authors that we can kind of use to begin a sort of a new aesthetic footing in this crumbling world.
The time has come.
So yes,
in
please.
This crumbling world.
I mean, I would appreciate it if you would even just like send me the work. But of course, I'm also happy to purchase a copy. But either way, that's on him. So.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, yes, please, Dave, do it. And everybody go check out Dave's stuff. You can find him over on Telegram as well as on Twitter. And poetry is just one of the many things that he publishes. So, Mr. Hat, I was imagining here it's pretty much a rambling discussion. So, we'll go wherever this leads us.
Yes.
But the way this opened for me was, whether or not there are particular types of poets. And there certainly do seem to be certain shared characteristics you would expect, facility with language, sensitivity, the ability to observe.
I think,
but
yes.
Beyond that, I don't know. What's your view on that?
I have quite a stringent view in that obviously the word poet is like the word artist. It's kind of like thrown around very generally. And I think that it's not something one should call themselves without a certain degree of awareness as to what it means. Like, how you see lots of like, sort of, I don't know, like middle-aged women and like sort of students who write awful, just egotistical sentences with line breaks in them, essentially. That those people are not poets, right? Like even in an ironic way, I hesitate to say like, so that I don't even like saying her name, but that one Canadian Indian like brown woman who published those weird books of, as I said, just basically egotistical sentences with line breaks in them. Rupi Kaur, I think her name is. I mean, like when I'm discussing people like that, I hesitate to use the word poet because I think it's cheapening the art, really. I very much like the way you brought that in with certain characteristics, like you said, the sort of the ability to use language imaginatively, and be creative, and to clearly have more than a passing interest in the way that words work together, and the way that the language can be kind of used as a kind of silk, if I want to be, slightly pretentious about it, that sense is, I mean, I basically would sum it up in a phrase by Clive James, who has a fantastic article which is available on the internet called "Letter to a Young Poet," obviously, in reference to the Rilke thing, and he says basically a poet is somebody for whom the poetry that they could write or do write is the most important thing in their life. and I think really that is it's a poetic way of describing what it takes to be a poet. That is what I'd say is the fundamental common thing between all the people that we're going to discuss today, is that they had the creativity, the imagination, and the intelligence to basically make the language sing. That's if we want to be perhaps slightly even dismissive about it, we could say that poetry is just prose that sings, right?
Yeah. Yes, I could see that. Yes, there's the idea to sing.
I also want to talk about the slightly odd modern preoccupation with what I would call rock star poets. In the same way that people are kind of obsessed with the idea of mad artists, which is odd to me, because I think with poetry, that's something that comes partially out of the Romantic era, with the idea of these people like Lord Byron, who are kind of these, raging, romping,
Rogering.
Great lovers of pleasure, fighters, revolutionaries, mad, bad, dangerous to know type people. But then you also have people like Baudelaire and Rimbaud, who we'll talk about later, who, have these kind of dissolute, pleasure-seeking lives, and, kind of reveled in the degradations of their times and so forth. And you obviously, in later times, you have someone like Dylan Thomas, who I think, unfortunately, has been more famous in the public eye for his slightly, well, let's be honest, a totally disastrous lifestyle and marriage, rather than his actual poems. Everybody has heard of Dylan Thomas, and most people can say, well, do not go, and all that kind of thing. But very few people have actually sat down and really read the poems. Even academics tend to kind of have a very surface level understanding of him. If you buy, you can get it quite cheaply, the Dylan Thomas omnibus that I think Faber put out, or it could be Barnes and Noble, I can't remember. But there's a really good single collected edition that you can quite thin, really. And if you just go through that and you really read the poems and not just the famous ones, there's clearly a lot about him that has not yet been said. There is a gift that has not yet really been appreciated because it's been overshadowed, I think, by the celebrity and by the vice. But of course, all of these people are really outliers in the same way that, people have a popular conception of a great artist like Van Gogh as being, this kind of tortured, half insane man who cuts off his ear and these things. But when you actually read about him, most of his best work, in fact, most of his work full stop, was done during periods of stability and happiness, not during these kind of mad outbreaks, because actually being a working artist takes, and this is true for both the visual arts and for poetry, though a bit more so for visual arts because of the types of labor involved. But it takes, quietude and practice, and it takes a level of kind of professionalism. That old adage of, well, you just have to get up and do it every day. And almost some artists would hate me saying this, but almost basically like an average working day. You have to get up and work at your art, whether it's something you're doing in a kind of quiet personal way, or something you've been commissioned to do. In fact, it's funny because most of the artists I meet, and including the many, many fine people in these dissident circles, people who actually make a living through art and practice it very regularly, are some of the most well-adjusted and stable people I know. They're very, very in control of their lives, which is a big outlier, I think, to how the public tend to perceive, successful artists or professional artists.
Yeah, there's certainly that dimension of anything ranging from being subversive to rebellious, iconoclastic, subversive, and there's much of that arguably is a more recent development. You certainly do see it with characters like Rimbaud or Baudelaire, as you were saying, and earlier, I don't doubt. I mean, one of the reasons probably that Francois Villon was, is a poet that people know of today. It's probably in considerable part because he was a rebel involved in crime, and got himself into trouble and these kinds of things. But it goes back much earlier, still, to the idea, as so famously, it's almost anyway, so famously with Plato in the Republic, saying that the poets should be expelled. So you certainly have the idea that there's subversion sort of is native to them.
I've always loved that that part of Plato. I remember when I was kind of like first, when I was in my sort of mid-teens, you kind of first ever political stuff, philosophical stuff. Obviously, one of the books you have to start with is Plato's Republic. And I remember just kind of almost like laughing out loud coming across it because it's so unexpected, just kind of like, yes, we have to banish all the poets and ban poetry from the Republic, because it's subversive. And there's a great line by, I want to say it was William Cobbett. It may not have been, but he wrote that Plato banished poets from his Republic, but forgot that Republic was merely poetical.
There is that dimension. And I wonder too if part of the idea of speaking out, the one who, as we put it so repulsively today, to speak truth to power, an expression that just is just makes me sick. But anyway, that's the way they usually say it. That's the cliched angle on it, right? Perhaps that's native to many poets too, because the idea is that you wish to speak your mind. I mean, and you're in fact compelled, driven in some respect to do so, even if it's only to capture the experience for yourself. So I guess it need not be, perhaps like an Emily Dickinson, writing her own stuff in private. Perhaps you don't have that element there, but I think it's probably one that you commonly find with many poets.
Well, I mean, I'm almost tempted to argue that I think that the introspective, kind of quiet, slightly boring people who also are poets, I think are the more common type, because not everybody can be a Byron. Not everybody wants to be living in poverty and having horrible love affairs, in the gutters of Paris, like Rimbaud did. You do.
Right,
I mean,
kicked out of society like Shelley. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I very often say unkind things about women when it comes to poetry, because I think there is genuinely some kind of spiritual barrier between women and poetry somehow. I'm going to get in terrible trouble for saying these things, but I do genuinely think it's true. But you do have exceptions. I mean, I agree with Harold Bloom's opinion on Emily Dickinson as being arguably one of the greatest American writers, and there is certainly a case you could make for her being among the greatest. Absolutely the top. I mean, she was an absolutely fantastic poet, and as you say, I mean, Emily Dickinson wasn't just introspective and quiet. She never left her bedroom. She wouldn't even come down to see people who came to the house. She would shout down the stairs rather than leave the room, which is kind of the introversion to an extreme. But with some excellent poetry as partially as a result of that lifestyle. I mean, a good example might be T.S. Eliot. He was considered extremely dull, and almost, by some people, even called him just vacuous in personal terms. He spent most of his life. I mean, he started off as basically a student. He did a PhD, spent a long time in university in a kind of traditional sort of upper class New England varsity type thing. Moved to Britain, became a bank worker, which he hated and was basically on the edge of poverty. And then when he wasn't doing that, I think he was just working for Faber as initially as a kind of mid-level publishing staff, and eventually as a director. And all the people at Faber who knew him for his kind of, great scene-rending, tumultuous poem, The Wasteland, with all this dramatic imagery and all this kind of, extremely sort of evocative stuff. And here comes this man in a kind of three-piece morning suit, with a bowler hat and a rolled umbrella, and they literally called him the old rolled umbrella. That was their nickname for him, because he was so straight laced.
Right, like he almost walked out of was it Gregor Samsa or whatever? Like he could have been a clerk in a Kafka story.
I mean, the proof rock of the famous J. Alfred proof rock. I mean, all those lines about I grow old, I will wear the bottom of my trousers rolled and my collar mounted firmly to the chin. Those lines always strike me as being very, very, I don't know what is the word, Eliot-esque. That basically, it's as I said, I think what we have when it comes to poets, it's not that poets are all introspective or all mad bad. It's that the particular gifts and personality traits you need to be a good poet fall so broadly that they hit more or less every single personality type.
Especially when you bear in mind the idea of the internal and external sort of experience, right? So in the case of a Byron, you've got this, literally, kind of larger than life, striding all over the joint, swimming the Hellespont, getting involved in having Austrian police keeping tabs on him in Italy before he goes off to get involved in all that business in Greece. But then you have like T.S. Eliot and Emily Dickinson, as mentioned, and there it seems that there is a consistent thread. It's a rich set of experiences, but in the case of these two, just pulling them out, for example, those are internal experiences, but the proof of the richness of them is that they were captured and communicated and ring true.
Yes, and the problem is, of course, with the kind of more extroverted, more external type, is that it provides a good cover for mediocrity, and it provides a cloak or a kind of fancy dress that you can wear. In the set, it's sort of like you could call yourself a poet, and you could, kind of romp around and do all this insane stuff. You could be a very bad poet, but you'd still get away with it, because you have a flamboyant enough lifestyle that it distracts, which is quite rare, I think, because there's not a lot of arts that you can really get away with that. You can be as dissolute and rambunctious as you want, but if you try and make music and it sounds awful, I doubt you'll get much traction. I mean, I'm trying to think of any examples that I may be wrong there, but I mean,
well, leaving aside the advent of types of music that intentionally sound like shit. So Sid Vicious, right? Is one who produced music that sounded like shit and lived in a wild way and is remembered more for how he lived, I guess.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose, the advent of some modern music does rather put paid to that. But I think that, I mean, it's awkward because no matter who I say it about, it's going to get me in trouble. But I'm thinking of certain poets of history that, okay. I mean, let's go back to my Dylan Thomas example. Again, he was a very great poet. And my point earlier was that his lifestyle precluded his poetry in the eyes of the world, if you see what I mean. That the lifestyle became more important than the world. But the ironic thing that as I've read more and more is that I find that this can almost also be true for the inverse, in that there are so many people who know Emily Dickinson because they know she was a famous shut-in. There are people who are obsessed with Fernando Pessoa because he led a kind of quiet, slightly Kafkaesque life in the suburbs of Lisbon and never left. But they don't read the poetry in both cases.
And one quick question for you, Hat. Sorry, this is just a technical thing. Is your mic particularly close to your mouth? Because it's
sorry,
it's getting a little bit it's blowing out the quality of it. Yeah.
I apologize. Yeah, I was.
Oh,
I was
no,
a bit close.
No worries. But I also want people in the chat, please let us know if it's like too far now. Like, give us some feedback on whether it sounds right.
Sorry,
Go on, Pat.
I turn the gain down slightly on the mic. But yes, this is one reason that I think some of the best analyzed, most closely looked at poetry tends to be kind of ancient and early medieval stuff, in which we know very little about the people that wrote it. Even somebody like Ovid, who we know certain details about his life that were reported to us later, but it's not like we can send a biographer to track his movements in between the kind of, taverns and arenas of the capital of Rome, can we? Because it's just too far removed. We can't trace his life in the same way we can trace Dylan Thomas's.
That was a point that was raised by D in a recent space of his on Twitter, where he was saying, I can't remember if you were there or not, but he was basically saying one of the types of, one of the things he appreciates is older art, where all traces of biographical details about the artists are, in many cases, even the name is entirely lost. And so you're forced to confront the work of art as it stands on its own. But I guess the question for us is, to what extent does the life become a part of it? In the case of prose, we have the example of Montaigne's essays, right? And that was something of an innovation at the time that he did it, in the sense that all he was going to do was set forth, these honest reflections that he had undertaken on these various topics. And so his life's work was a reflection on things that just occurred to him. We've got Francois Villon, who, what we know of him is really just from his testament, other than a few records of him, having been a minor cleric.
And certain run-ins with the law,
Yeah, you're right.
There's quite a number of legal and prison books that have his name in them.
Right, stabbing people, throwing rocks at fellow priests. On the other hand, you take a look at Byron. We mentioned that earlier, or even Shelley. Their lives are. You get movies like that crap movie Gothic, where the film is just them. Don't bother. But the film is just about them as these characters, these larger than life characters that can be almost divorced from their poetry, or Dickinson as a shut-in. So it becomes very difficult to unwind their lives from their works, as you would expect, but somehow these things can happen regardless over time. The work stands stark and on its own without these additions after enough time has passed, or it becomes indistinguishable from the caricature of the person. And perhaps I'm going after this particular angle a bit too much, but the whole idea of the stream is the lives of these people, and to what degree, if any, it bears on their work, and what we can learn from looking at their lives for once, instead of just at their work.
Yes. And I think that, it's a bit of a problem, because I have basically contradictory views on it. Because on the one hand, I'm very much in the camp of how we discussed earlier, in which, is in the same point that Mr. D made, in which, sometimes one of the greatest things about art and anonymous art is that we can't read into the artist's life. We only have the work, which in a sense is the perfect way to take it. But I personally am also a real obsessive for biographical detail. I fully admit this is perhaps somewhat wrong of me, because I take a different approach when it comes to the actual practice. But I am an obsessive. I do. If I get particularly interested in an author, I will buy as many books on them as I can. I know details about Dylan Thomas's coffee cups, or where Pessoa liked to drink wine, and this kind of thing, or what size of desk and stationery Dickinson used. So if you see what I mean, there's I have to fight these twin urges of kind of, one, just wanting to take the art as it is, and two, being rather girlishly obsessed with certain more or less irrelevant details. Yes, and somebody in the chat, Angry, has posted the quote I was about to mention, where Heidegger began a very, very important, very, very famous series of lectures on Aristotle during the early 1930s. And in the German, and you know how the Germans love their kind of academic precedents and traditions, and you have to follow all the academic conventions very, very rigorously. Well, it was common to devote a huge chunk of the early lectures, sometimes as much as half of them, to biography and to talking about the life of the subject. And Heidegger completely bucked this tradition by beginning his first lecture with, as it says in the chat, "What was Aristotle's life? Well, the answer lay in a single sentence. He was born, he thought, he died. All the rest is anecdote." So if you see, it's a conflicting thing. But as I say, we're here to talk about the lives of the poets. So perhaps we should
jump in on some of them.
Yeah.
Well, shall we take this chronologically?
No.
For the hell of it.
I would like to mix around a bit, because I want to reinforce the point I made about the virtues you need to be a poet can apply to you regardless of any other circumstances.
Well, then carry it away, sir.
I mean, John Clare for a lot of his life was barely literate, but but nevertheless wrote some of the greatest poems in the English language. Well, I mean, one example I'd like to start with, because it's quite a striking one, is one of your suggestions, which is Wilfred Owen.
Yes, it's a short enough life to grasp, unfortunately. Yes. But the fruit of it is well, let's just say striking.
Yes, I mean, you introduced us to Wilfred Owen and his life, and what in particular interests you about it?
Well, to me, it seems like he had his family was not particularly well off. They were in straitened financial circumstances. So he was not able to pursue an education, perhaps quite of the quality that he had wanted to. But there are some signals, some signs in his early correspondence and in manuscripts left over with his other family members, that there are some early flashes of things that show that there's a muse there, that there's or there's a, let's be less amorphous about it, that there's a facility with language paired with a certain minimum requirement for any poet of sensitivity, and then it appears that he went off in order to find a way to continue his education in a situation where the family didn't have much in the way of financial support for him. He went off and as I recall, he studied under a vicar, is what you guys call them, a vicar. Yes. And this vicar, he sort of satirically remarked he wasn't very pleased with him, that he had a collection of picture frames at home, and he would go out and find photos and pictures to buy to fit the frames, which seemed something that Owen really didn't care for. I think I have here. There was a point at which he had considered, apparently during this time, that he was going to be that he would perhaps go into the clergy, and basically he around this time. So the author the editor and intro writer for this particular volume I have, who is this collected poems of Wilfred Owen, the C. de Lewis, surmised that Owen developed a kind of social conscience, because he has reference to letters around 1912 that Owen sent home to his mother, with whom he was very close, with whom he maintained a steady correspondence. It was about, starving children, and, that he's seen on the street a gentle little girl of 5, fast sinking under consumption, contracted after chicken pox, talking about the pitiable state of it. And he basically, a short time thereafter, less than a year, it looks like, at some point in 1913, he wrote to his mother, "I have murdered my false creed. If a true one exists, I shall find it. If not, adieu to the still falser creeds that hold the hearts of nearly all my fellow men." And then he went through some things, continuing his education. He shortly thereafter, he got a position as an English tutor at the Berlitz School of Languages in Bordeaux. And around that time, shortly thereafter, there war broke out, and he returned. Or I'm sorry, between the business of working at the school, he worked with a family, and then he, as I understand it, returned after a time to Britain and volunteered. Unless I've, it's possible I have some of these details wrong, because I'm certainly no kind of expert on it. But before we get to the battlefield stuff, is there anything you would add, or that you think I'm missing? I certainly am.
I mean, it's something that is almost a very archetypical kind of early 1900s sort of English sort of academic life. Sort of comes from lower middle class roots. Clever, loves to read, is able to get into a good university, but doesn't have the money to, and goes for seems to go for the priesthood, and then more or less ends up in the war. I mean, but of course, the incredible thing about the First World War in retrospect is how it sort of just swings out of nowhere and interrupts all these lives, and you wonder how these lives would have gone on had it not been for that incredible divergence point of the war. I mean, I think. See, what's odd is that but again, his gifts are there. He isn't so much. I have some trouble with the whole thing around the war poets, because his gift is there regardless. He can write just as well about men leaving a mine shaft than he can about
drowning,
drowning, anything like that. I should say, on a personal note, I mean, I very much believe Wilfred Owen deserves the place he has in the English canon, but personally, I have some difficulties with some of his poems. That's all I'm going to say, but for some fantastic pieces. But I think the real sad thing is that he was killed before his work reached its full maturity. And I think that looking at the power and the promise of those poems written just before and during the war, he would have gone on to have been a first-rate poet regardless. He was headed that way, and I know it's, you can never be absolutely certain, but there is very much a tragedy to his wasted talent.
Which is emblematic, of course, of the war itself. Yeah.
Yes, and even more sad because he was wounded in 1918, and at the end of August
decided to go back.
Yeah, right? He was perfectly within his rights to remain home on leave till he'd fully recovered, but he went back and was killed exactly a week before the armistice.
Yes, and he has some very interesting remarks on his experiences. This in this introduction, Davis. Was it Davis? Yes. No, sorry. C.D. Lewis remarks, "To the soldier, those on the other side of the barbed wire were fellow sufferers. He felt less hostility towards them than towards the men and women who were profiting by the war, sheltered from it, or willfully ignorant of its realities." Shortly after Owen was sent for a second time out of the line, a victim of a neurasthenia caused, he said, by living so long in the disiecta membra of a friend, meaning in the blown up bits of someone else, being in the shell craters where and he remarks upon it in his poetry, where your foot goes down too deep and it half exhumes a corpse. He wrote, and this is a letter of May 2nd, 1917. Already I have comprehended a light which will never filter into the dogma of any national church, namely that one of Christ's essential commands was passivity at any price. And Christ's price, he's just doing it in his letters. He can't help. Suffer dishonor and disgrace, but never resort to arms. Be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill. Christ is literally in no man's land. There men often hear his voice. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. Is it spoken in English only and French? I do not believe so. And then the author here, he says, this was not the Christ of Owen's religious upbringing. It was the one whom David Gascoigne addressed many years later as the Christ of revolution and poetry. He appears again in a letter Owen wrote to Osbert Sitwell on July 4th, 1918, when he was training troops in England and himself preparing to return to the front. For 14 hours yesterday, I was at work, teaching Christ to lift his cross by numbers and how to adjust his crown, and not to imagine he thirst till after the last halt. I attended his supper to see that there were not complaints, and inspected his feet, that they should be worthy of the nails. I see to it that he is dumb and stands at attention before his accusers. With a piece of silver, I buy him every day, and with maps, I make him familiar with the topography of Golgotha. And there's just a last bit here I want to include because it's very striking. Wilfred Owen went back to the front line because he felt that there he would be in a stronger position to voice his protest against the war and speak for his comrades. On October 4th, 1918, he wrote home about the action in which he won his military cross, a battle which, and here it's quoting Owen, a battle which, quote, past the limits of my abhorrence. I lost all earthly faculties and fought like an angel. You will guess what has happened when I say I am now commanding the company, and in the line had a boy lance corporal as my sergeant major. With this corporal, who stuck to me and shadowed me like your prayers, I captured a German machine gun and scores of prisoners. He closes with, my nerves are in perfect order. And then it closes with, a month later, to the day, he was killed.
It's incredibly... I mean, okay, so first of all, the content of the letter, as you say, is a poem in itself, in my opinion. I mean, hearing it read aloud, you can hear the almost unconscious, prosody and scansion and meter that's going on in that letter. And it seems strange that he almost seemed reconciled to the war, not in its happening, but in its matter. He, like he said, like that line, that haunting line, I fought like an angel, and talks about being, clearly, I don't know what the word would be, adjusted to, he seems to almost relish the combat and the experience, in a way that it's almost quite scary to hear when you think of what he was like as a person based on what we know, that he would become so enthralled into the combat like that, But
yes, and at the same time that you're having an outpouring, where clearly your gift is coming to you. I when I started reading poetry, I thought, oh well, I must write it, and there was an entire phase of just hating everything that I had written and seeing that it didn't have that it was either empty or dishonest. I call a dishonest poem an image that you didn't really see, an image that you cobbled together because you thought it would be fitting to share it as though you had been struck by it, but it wasn't an image that really truly had come to you. And in that respect, I find his many of his fragments are particularly interesting to me, because that's often how a poem will start for me. And in this, please, everyone should understand that I'm not, claiming that I'm a great poet like the greatest poets. I certainly like what I write, and I think that it's justifiable, but so when I compare myself to any of these other poets we talk about, it's only interesting to me, or it should be understood that I'm only doing it insofar as it's a way for me to find my way through what we know of other poets by comparing it to my own experiences. I certainly don't wish to make claims for myself, but so this is one fragment of his. Again, these are interesting to me because that's often how a poem starts for me. But a really striking image will almost slap me, and I just have to go and sit down and try to put it down and capture it. And this is one. I saw his round mouths crimson, deepen as it fell, like a sun in his last deep hour. Watched the magnificent recession of farewell, clouding, half gleam, half glower, and a last splendor burn the heavens of his cheek, and in his eyes the cold stars lighting, very old and bleak, in different skies. It's just it's got a hammer blow of it, the images, I mean, there's even he often talks about the idea of hell mouths, referring to shell holes in this way, and you can almost see the mouth of a fallen comrade or foe, open and widen as an image, even in this fragment. But I don't know where to take this next. There's at least one other poem that I'd like to read here before we move on. But I wanted to see if
please do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this one is this is one that sort of brings together his whole idea that he had to stand up for these others and be a voice like Sassoon and some of these other war poets. This one is called Dulce et Decorum Est, which, for those who are not good with Latin, it's sweet and fitting, I believe. It is sweet and fitting. And of course, the rest of that is, I believe, to die for one's country. And it goes as follows. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
It's when you actually read the title, I was slightly taken aback because here in the UK, that poem has entered the national consciousness, and it's seriously. I don't know about it in America. You'd have to tell me, but here that poem is everybody will encounter it during their schooling, no matter how rudimentary that schooling is. And in fact, I recently have been speaking to people about the First World War, and it's interesting because it's one of the few wars in which the poet's view of the war, here in the UK at least, among the public, has become the dominant view. Everybody more or less shares the view that the entire war was, one long slog through a gas-filled trench, which again, this is, and we're here to talk about poetry, not history. And I mean, it is certainly one of the great poetic achievements of the 20th century, without a doubt, But I don't know. I suppose you'd have to come here and really see for yourself. But I can't really get across in into words the level to which that poem underscores the entire war for Britain, for the British public memory of it, I suppose. And I don't know if you're aware, but that poem was written in response to a quite well-known poem written by a woman called Jessie Pope, who was encouraging. She basically wrote some quite tin-eared recruitment verse, or it seems tin-eared in retrospect. And that line about "my friend, you would not tell with such high zest" is it's a line addressed directly to Mrs. Pope. It's only a short poem, but the poem he's responding to is called "Who's for the Game." And I love to read it because it's such a wonderful, ironic clash between what you just read and what you're about to hear.
Please do.
It's only short. So here we go. Who's for the Game by Jessie Pope. Who's for the game, the biggest that's played? The red crashing game of a fight? Who'll grip and tackle the job unafraid? And who thinks he'd rather sit tight? Who'll toe the line for the signal to go? Who'll give his country a hand? Who wants a turn to himself in the show? And who wants a seat in the stand? Who knows it won't be a picnic, not much, yet eagerly shoulders a gun? Who would much rather come back with a crutch than lie low and be out of the fun? Come along, lads, but you'll come on all right, for there's only one course to pursue. Your country is up to her neck in a fight, and she's looking and calling for you.
Yeah. Tin-eared was charitable.
Yeah.
I don't think that. Wilfred Owen is not as well known here. Certainly, many people have heard of him. It was an American person who first told me about him and said I really had to read his stuff. But poetry in general doesn't really play a part in education. I think there were probably, in English literature, back in the days of when I was in high school, you would encounter a few poets, in your English class or whatever, but not many, not Owen, and the time in the days since, I'm sure it's disappeared entirely. I mean, I remember being out at Berkeley, and there was a woman I was dating out there who was going to school there, and we were all sitting around as, people of that age do, drinking wine and smoking cigarettes, loitering, and, talking about shit. Loitering uselessly. And we all started getting into poetry, and I was like, well, can anyone recite it by memory? And because I had committed a number of poems to memory, and everyone there,
it's a very good habit, by the way. Just everyone,
and you carry it with you thereafter, But everyone scoffed at that, the whole idea. And that was like 1991. So even by 91, college students were laughing at the idea that you would memorize a poem, and that it was that's just rote memorization. And why would anyone do that? So that by way of response to your curiosity about whether or not Owen is well known here. So I knew none of those things that you mentioned, like the poem that it balanced against.
Yes. Anyway, shall we move on to another life?
Yes. Whom would you suggest?
Well, there's plenty to choose. I mean, let's do another somewhat exciting one. I'd like to talk about Arthur Rimbaud, if I'm pronouncing that right.
I think it's Rimbaud, but
Rimbaud.
my French is yeah.
Yeah, well,
awful.
I mean, same here. I have no idea. I mean, I'll probably pronounce it several different ways through the stream. I'll probably say, Rombo, Rambo, all through. So I have
Rambunctious.
absolutely,
Yes.
yeah, I'm not going to make any attempt to actually. I don't. But to be fair, I think he was from Alsace, if I'm not wrong, or at least from the German border. So he had a very, very strong sort of Ardennes type accent. And apparently his name is, like, depending on where you are in France, it can be pronounced variously. So anyway, we'll move on from that. But yes, Arthur Rimbaud, one of the most famous poets of the last few hundred years. Obviously French, son of an army officer, came from a fairly established family. They were property owning. Good sort of French middle class, quite strongly Catholic lot. But this changed when his parents, his father was a captain in the army and was constantly being posted. Rimbaud was born during a particularly tumultuous period where there was the Crimean War. Napoleon III launched wars in Italy. He conquered Algeria, Mexico. So Rimbaud's father was being sent all over the place. And so Rimbaud spent most of his time not at home, but at boarding school, where he was known as being a pretty bad student. I mean, certainly not the most well behaved. And he very much disliked the classical education he was given. He hated having to do Latin. He much preferred kind of like street games and what do you Americans call it? Is it playing hooky? To actually doing schoolwork and such.
It's truancy.
Truancy, yeah, not a totally unsympathetic position, I think. But he did actually end up sparking, despite his hatred of kind of classroom Latin. He did actually have a flair for the classic languages. And he began to read, French medieval poems and the kind of troubadour poems, and I think he was able to get Greek and all this kind of thing. And then by the time he's 17 years old, he's certainly been writing poems for a while. And yet he sends some to Villon, Paul Villon, obviously another famous French poet and one with an equally tumultuous life. And Rimbaud, at the age of 17, goes to stay with him, basically. He more or less runs away. He couldn't even afford the train ticket, and also the Franco-Prussian War was causing chaos in France. So he basically slips out and goes to live with Verlaine. And I think more or less immediately they begin a homosexual relationship, despite the fact that Verlaine is actually married to a woman and has a daughter, I think, or son. And this is obviously a scandalous thing to do in the 1870s. They start sort of spending their days wandering the cafes, taking Persian hashish, opium, absinthe, all these kind of famous substances of the time. They have no money. They publish poems which start to make them famous, and to hark back to what we said at the beginning, I think the lifestyle, the scandals caused by this lifestyle, partially gave their poems a bit of a leg up into the kind of fashionable Parisian newspapers and intellectual circles and so forth. Then Verlaine and Rimbaud completely abandon the former's wife and child and flee to London to scrape together a living from teaching. Verlaine also was, a raging alcoholic by this point and had beaten his wife and son black and blue during his time there. So perhaps it was quite a welcome break for them from him. They make very little from teaching in London, but Rimbaud now has access to the British Museum and the British Library, where, of course, they both have reading rooms where you can go in for free. And they're heated rooms. There's pen, paper, ink, lighting. It's all you can go in there. Even now you can go in there. It's all free and still use it. And while they're in London, their relationship starts to kind of collapse, and Rimbaud is seen as this kind of dirty, rude sort of sprat. And they end up going back to Paris after about, I think, was it 2 years, maybe a year, if that. There's a famous painting of a load of Parisian poets. This is the sort of first rank, if you want, by Fontaine-Latour. And I can't remember who it was, but one of the poets meant to be pictured refused to be in the painting when he heard that Rimbaud was going to be in it. And so that's why on the far right of the picture there's a big collection of flowers, because there was meant to be a person there, but he refused to be in it, so he had to be replaced with something. And they continued arguing and drinking, and then eventually Villon shoots Rimbaud in the arm. The bullet hits his wrist with a revolver. And I think that's more or less where things fall apart. Rimbaud flees back to his family, and completes a prose book called Un Saison d'Enfer, or Season in Hell, which is as very much as good as his poetry, and a very entertaining read. Very important for the symbolists and such. And he more or less freely admits all the kind of, sodomy and immorality that they were committing together. He publishes Illuminations, which is his main poetry collection. Well, no, my mistake. He actually he attempts to get it published, but there's difficulties, and at this point, I think he's more or less given up on poetry. He goes to he wants to get out of France. I think he must be what? He's born in 1854, so he's in his sort of mid to late 20s by this point. Joins the Dutch colonial army. He doesn't actually want to fight for the Dutch in Indonesia. He just wants to get on a ship to get out of France. He jumps ship and flees into the jungle. He has to end up back to France because he can't get caught by the Dutch military on the seas. And eventually he ends up in Ethiopia, where he becomes a gun buying agent and a coffee merchant for the Emperor of Ethiopia on behalf of the French. So he is importing guns, coffee, all sorts of goods for the Emperor. And he does this until the early 1890s, when he becomes ill. I think he has a cancer in his leg or something. Goes back to France. His leg is amputated, and he dies not long after. And somebody who comes into poetry as a child, completely revolutionizes it, then quits, goes to Africa, and dies not long after. Aged, I think he was 37 when he died.
As you said, it's not we're not doing a stream on history, but it's interesting once again that you sort of see this European experience, during the periods of colonialism and world expansion, and having to seek your fortune abroad because there's simply nothing for you at home. Yes. And being thrown into a much wider world, but strangely, really just setting aside the poetry. I mean, is there anything from his later life that involves poetry?
No,
I don't remember.
I think he wrote letters which have been collected, but as far as I'm aware, all of the poetry was done during that tumultuous period with Verlaine. And in A Season in Hell, Rimbaud actually writes that in order to be a good poet, he had to make his life hell. He was somebody who couldn't function creatively with a kind of stable, steady life. He had to be having these terrible, awful love affairs and arguments and drink and drugs and all that. He kind of needed that in order to produce the things he produced. You know, I mean, you read something like one of his most famous poems, "The Drunken Boat." You know, where he took, you know, very, very important for the kind of oncoming symbolists and later for the sort of Poundian imagists, because he talks about, you know, things like, you know, vomit and, you know, water lapping and, you know, phosphors and, you know, colors and all this kind of stuff, where it's more a kind of sensory emotional experience as opposed to a traditional poem which simply places a subject and deals with it, you know, in a kind of linear fashion, if you like. You know, as I said, basically, you know, part of that revolution, and then, you know, he quits. It's one of the very few people who basically was a poet and said, "I quit." Lots of poets have creative block or writer's block, or they die early, or they lead dissolute lives. But I'm pretty sure it's only Rimbaud that has been such a star, then gone, and I'm done. That's all I need to do. Now I'm leaving for Africa. Bye.
Right. He's like, that's it. Yeah. It puts me in mind of a thing about Shelley. Where is it? I just came across it reviewing stuff about him, and he was, what was it he said? It was something having to do with living with for a time with Byron. And I can't, it's going to take me forever to find it, but it was something along the lines of him writing a letter home and saying that he's been living with Byron. And he says, basically, you know, it won't kill me in 4 days or 4 weeks, but I can't do it forever. You know? Yeah. So there's probably some aspect of that was going on with, yes, with Rimbaud as well. Did you have any poems by him you wanted to?
Well, the issue is, of course, that they're all in French, and
yeah, all the translations will be of very the same problem with the stuff for Villon. Yeah,
yeah.
Well, I have one if you wanted to give it some thought.
Yes, please do.
And it's, you know, one of the ones that isn't such a long rambling one, but I think it has its merits in terms of showing the way in which he took as the object of his attention things that were dirty, things that you would discover if you did your season in hell. This one, again, its translation, as Hat was saying. So for our listeners, you know, your mileage may vary, but yes, this one is called The Seekers of Lice. When the child's forehead, full of red torments, implores the white swarm of indistinct dreams, there come near his bed 2 tall, charming sisters with slim fingers that have silvery nails. They seat the child in front of a wide open window where the blue air bathes a mass of flowers, and in his heavy hair, where the dew falls, move their delicate, fearful, and enticing fingers. He listens to the singing of their apprehensive breath, which smells of long, rosy plant honey, and which at times a hiss interrupts, saliva caught on the lip or desire for kisses. He hears their black eyelashes beating in the perfumed silence, and their gentle electric fingers make in his half-drunken indolence the death of the little lice crackle under their royal nails. Then the whine of sloth rises in him, the sigh of an harmonica which could bring on delirium. The child feels, according to the slowness of the caress, surging in him and dying continuously, a desire to cry. And so here you've got this image of lice swarming on the head, but they're a white swarm of indistinct dreams, as though the lice themselves are feeding upon his consciousness.
Those early symbolist poems are so magnificent in how they burn, don't they? You know, the way they throw images at you that sort of catch you, and you sort of you appear to almost experience them directly before you sort of remember that it's just a poem.
Yeah,
That takes some real
strong
skill.
images,
I
very
want
strong
to
images.
read you the opening quatrain, and it's all in French Alexandrines from The Drunken Boat, and I will attempt to do the first the first quatrain in French, and then I'll say it in English.
Just to be able to
I'm
hear the
using the
song of
Fowler
it.
translation. Yeah, because the thing is, I don't have much of an understanding of French, but once you sort of, if you buy yourself a cheap copy of these poems, you can actually get a pencil and sort of annotate in various understandings of different words and different phrases. And you can begin to actually build up a very, very keen idea of the senses of the poem, even if you don't quite get the language. I mean, this is something that Ezra Pound talked about. T.S. Eliot said that a good enough poem will give some of its meaning to anybody who doesn't speak the language, because it will have a certain tone and a certain feel to the words that will communicate something, even if you don't understand them, basically.
Yes, just very quickly, there's a book called How to Kill a Dragon by Watkins that's on Indo-European poetics, and simply reading that book, because it had it had the original poems and then discussions of them in translation, and many of them are very small fragments, so they're more suitable to do what you're talking about, to go through that exercise, because there's just a little bit there that's under discussion. But you can hear the pacing, the rhythm, and in particular for me, there was the stuff with syllable timed poetry, which is, something little seen in English. It's usually stress timed. So yeah, for all those listening, when you get a hold of poetry from written in other languages, certainly obtain the ones that have the original on a facing page, so that you can do what Hat is talking about here.
Those are always the best, because they give you room for interpretation. And of course, just a full disclaimer, my French is appalling. So any francophones listening, or at a later date listening, please say where I'm going wrong in the comments or in the chat. So anyway, let's attempt this. The first quatrain of The Drunken Boat. Comme je descendais des fleurs impassibles, je ne me sentis plus guidé par les allures. Des prodiges créaient les avions plus possibles, les ayant cloués, nous sommes poteaux de couleurs. And that translates as I was going down impassive rivers, I no longer felt myself guided by haulers. Yelping redskins had taken them as targets and had nailed them naked to colored stakes. Which is a real blast of early symbolism.
I mean, naked to colored stakes.
I mean, you still see a lot of that influence now, with just the cadence of those lines, and a lot of modern poets, if they're worthy of the term, don't actually realize the influences that they're working under when they write lines like that, and they can't do them half as well. But yes, I mean, just going back to the kind of the life section. I think along with Baudelaire, Rimbaud is probably the archetypical, enfant terrible, kind of, drunken, immoral poet, kind of rampaging around, doing all these dissolute things, and I think a lot of people can still admire somebody like Byron, because he had these kind of great liberal political ideas of his day, this kind of revolutionary spirit that people can sort of are allowed to look up to. But with Rimbaud, there was none of that. It was a purely inward, pleasure-seeking kind of, as you say, a season in hell. And that's kind of, almost as the centuries progress, you can start to see the decline. Even the dissolute poets are in decline.
And you
Baudelaire
never would
certainly
have
as
heard,
well.
yeah, you never would have heard Byron writing a poem about picking lice out of hair. Yeah.
No, I don't think so. But yes, I mean, I'm not sure there's much else to say about Rimbaud in particular. I mean, his life was very short, longer than Wilfred Owen, I think.
Yeah. So he's winning. Keep it up, lads. We're winning. But with yeah, I think it's worth noting one last thing before we move on to another poet, and that is that here we can see the aspect of the inner life that came up in the discussion earlier, because for me at least, it seems clear that there are echoes of childhood experiences in this idea of the seekers of lice, because he was a child. I mean, hell, I remember, catching head lice in elementary school and having to be ministered to by my mother, and certainly with his, homosexuality later, there does seem to be a story being told there, about perhaps some ways in which being raised as he was in the environment he was, led to some other things. But certainly there is that rich inner life, because you then take it. It can be an honest poem. It's striking in its imagery. The source of the poesy is there in a quite mundane personal experience that he must have had himself, no doubt, certainly in the 19th century. But it's how he turns that within the mind's eye, or within the realm of images within him, that yields the multiple layers of meaning. Yes. So
Yeah.
anyway, well, who then should we consider next?
Well, do you have any that you want to choose from? Because you started, I did this one, so it's your go next, I think.
All right. Well, Villon is one, and I have no idea if that's. I don't even know if in Old French, two L's are pronounced like a Y or whatever. So again, anyone who knows anything about French, feel free to laugh, or to tie yourself to a mast and plug your ears with wax. But Villon, there's not a great deal to be said about his life, though, for someone that far back, in the middle of the 15th century. We do know a bit, and it's primarily from his greatest poems, so it is understood, called The Testament. Let's see here. I have in my collection of his poems some stuff about his life. Does it say from the open? I'll just kind of skip through this to the relevant parts. From the open, and this is from poems by Francois Villon, translated from the French by David Georgie, trumpeted as a new translation. From the opening lines of his masterwork, The Testament, and from the letter by which King Charles the Seventh pardoned him for knifing the priest. It's a great way to open. We can gather that Villon was born around 1430. His name originally was Francois de Montcorbière. Montcorbière. Nothing is known of his parents, and what little we can surmise about his early life is based on a few stanzas of his poetry, in which he mentions his foster father, who was a teacher of canon law at the University of Paris, and a chaplain at a church called Saint Benedict the Backward, apparently because the altar was at the wrong end of the church, facing the west.
That's fantastic. That's some Spanish level architectural cock-ups. Yeah.
and yes, preserved for posterity. And so he probably grew up in the church's cloister. Paris was in a rough state at that point, because it was in the hands of the English for something like, 16 years. Can't remember the details. Eventually they got it back in 1436. But then there's records from the University of Paris, at that time already known as the Sorbonne, They indicate that Villon completed his bachelor's degree in 1449 and was inducted as a Master of Arts in 1452. The title of maître made him a minor cleric, not an ordained priest or monk, but tonsured, like other churchmen, qualified to hold certain church positions and licensed to teach. Apart from these dates in the archives of the university, there are no records of Villon's life until the day he stabbed the priest. It was June 5th, 1455, around 9 o'clock in the morning. Villon was out on the Rue Saint-Jacques, sitting on a rock at the foot of the clock tower of St. Benedict's the Backward, with a priest named Gilles, and a woman named Isabeau. Philippe Sermois, also a priest, happened past and immediately accosted Villon, if we can believe Villon's account of events. Villon's friends quickly took off and left him alone with Sermois. The priest took out a dagger and slashed Villon across the mouth, opening a bloody cut on his lower lip. Villon pulled out his own knife and struck at Sermois, going for the neighborhood of the groin. Certain he had missed, Villon later claimed he dodged away, but the priest came after him. Villon picked up a rock, threw it at Sermois, hitting him in the face, and ran off. Bleeding copiously, Villon went to a barber named Fouquet, who bandaged the wound. Sermois was carried into the cloister of St. Benedict's and received some medical care, but worsened, and the next day was taken to the Hôtel Dieu, where he died from his wounds. Villon fled Paris. While he was on the run, he petitioned the king. In 1456, something in the range of a year later, he was granted a full pardon, apparently on the strength of being, in the words of the royal pardon, which is the source of our detailed information on the event, a man who, quote, conducts himself well and honorably without ever having been arrested, accused, or convicted of any other malicious deed. The writer here says if he was an innocent then, Villon wouldn't remain one for long. Before the year was out, he fled Paris again, this time for fear of being implicated in stealing the savings of the university's theology professors. He was apparently hanging out with a number of people famous for being, fortis operator crocetorum, being quite skilled with lockpicks. Two guys who are apparently quite good at that. The target was the College de Navarre, and from an adjacent house, empty that night, they used a ladder to scale the wall of the college. They broke into the strongbox containing the college's savings and made off with around 500 gold écus, a considerable haul. And then he went on the lam. A witness testified that he went to stay with his uncle in an abbey in Angers, where there was a rich old monk he was keen to rob. He wandered for a few years. There's not a great deal of information on him. He was a guest of the Duke of Orléans, and in a handwritten album of poems, it appears that a few of the poems written there that the Duke collected were written by Villon himself in his own hand. In 1461, he spent a few summer months in the dungeon of the Bishop of Orléans. And it seems he was released that time because the king came through, newly crowned Louis the 11th, and he was given amnesty. But then at the end of the following year, he was back in Paris and back in jail on suspicion of robbery. He was soon released, but was free only for a few weeks when he was caught up in the arrests following a scuffle, which had ended with the stabbing of the Pope's Paris notary. He wasn't the one with the knife this time and seems to have been slightly involved, but they apparently did some sort of three strikes and you're going down rule. So he was sentenced to hang. He was unwilling to go along with that, and he appealed his case directly to the Parlement, which at this time was not a legislative body, but a court that judged cases and appeals. And his appeal was granted. The death sentence was commuted to 10 years banishment from Paris. He celebrates this in a poem, taunting the prison clerk, and another that thanks the court. And then that's the last we hear of him. And so, yeah, would you have anything to add on this
a
character?
very elliptic life, isn't it? Kind of popping in and out of infamous sort of books of infamy, shall we call them, ledgers of infamy.
Yeah, and stabbing, trying to stab priests in the groin, getting cut himself in fights, robbing people, throwing rocks at people's faces, all with his tonsured head, you know?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, hugely influential on European poetry as a whole, you know, among the most translated works, influenced so much, you know. It's just incredible to me that, you know, it just makes me think about how perhaps almost too well recorded modern lives can be, you know. It's like how much easier would it be to put together a biography of, say, T.S. Eliot if we had his, like, I don't know, Facebook and Twitter you know, to kind of trawl through, you know, to work out what he was doing, you know, every minute of every day. And yet you have somebody like this who totally transcends the mundane aspects of biography and appears to us only in basically criminal records,
court documents.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the Argentinian writer Borges.
Yes.
Jorge Luis, who was always writing kind of experimental stories about, you know, the nature of sort of the nature of being able to record things, the nature of time and such. It almost feels like a kind of Borgesian fiction. Like there would be a collection of short stories which comprise the prison records of Francois Villon. You know,
right there in the Garden of Forking Paths.
Yeah, yes. like he wrote that story about he wrote a short story which was a fictional review, but framed as like a real one, of a book written by a Bengali lawyer in the 1930s, which was like a mystery detective novel. And the confusion was that people thought it was a real review of a real book, and they sent orders off to booksellers all over the world asking for a copy of this fake book that was written by this Indian barrister from Calcutta or something. You know, and I just it would be great to kind of, I feel, just, you know, from a personal one of some sort of, if you like, a sort of writer's point of view, to experiment with stuff like this and kind of, you know, can you create fictional biographies through the mediums of things like prison records and court documents and kind of, you know, kind of jury testimonies and things like that. Just because, you know, it's as I said, it's so interesting to just see this life told from that perspective, and that's how you're able to trace what he's doing. And it seems he's always getting into trouble, you know, despite being a kind of fairly well-off, sort of bourgeois, educated man. Basically lives this kind of slightly rough sort of wandering life, doesn't he?
Yes, and clearly uses his skill with the poetry and his skill with language to write these letters begging to be let off of the hook. Yes. And apparently it works in at least one or two cases. And so his skill with language is a kind of shield for him. And he crows about things afterwards. I have two poems that I'd throw in here. Or do you have any in particular of his that?
No, you please go ahead.
Okay, well, the first one is just it's called the ballad of Proverbs. Now, again, this is a translation, and it does not have the rhyme, and so you're not going to get this. But the one thing that you get out of that, you lose the pleasure of the poetry itself, but by not trying to rhyme it, they are, of course, more faithful to the meaning of the words. So you can at least, dear listeners, get some sense of what he was saying, if not entirely how he was saying it. So yeah, Ballad of Proverbs. If the goat stamps all night, she won't sleep. If the pot's watched enough, it won't boil. If the iron's hot enough, you can strike. If you strike enough times, you're out. If out of sight enough, soon out of mind. If a man's valued enough, he's thought worthy. If he's bad enough, he'll be despised. If you shout Christmas enough, it arrives. If you talk enough, you'll dig your own grave. If you are praised enough, you'll expect privilege. If you promise enough, you'll deceive. If you ask enough, ye shall receive. If you see others desire it, you'll covet. If it's common enough, you won't love it. If you try enough, you'll succeed. If you shout Christmas enough, it arrives. If a dog's your best friend, you will feed it. If a tune's heard enough, you will learn it. If a fruit is saved long enough, it goes rotten. If you knock long enough, you'll get in. If you hesitate enough, all is lost. If you hasten enough, you'll make waste. If you hold tight enough, things slip away. If you shout Christmas enough, it arrives. If you joke enough, nobody laughs. If you spend time enough, you'll lose your shirt. If you're generous enough, you'll end up broke. If you're promised enough, you'll be left in the lurch. If you love God enough, you'll get thee to church. If you lend enough, you'll soon learn to borrow. If the wind turns enough, it blows cold. If you shout Christmas enough, it arrives. Prince, if a fool lives long enough, he will learn. If he goes far, that far he'll return. If he's beaten enough, he may grow wise. If you shout Christmas enough, it arrives. And that's a bit of classic Villon in the sense of something that
you can. Sorry, go on. I'm interrupting.
Just the last point. You can hear him reciting that in a bar with everyone drinking, and the people being able to get traction and to anticipate where it's going in some respects because he's using all these old proverbs. And that's sort of a classic aspect of his raucous poems. But you were saying,
you can also you can hear the influence of the troubadours, can't you? Like clearly, this wasn't just meant to be read; it was meant to be sung. You know, with those constant repeating refrains and lines and kind of echoes of all through it. You know, or at least that's how I understand it. You know, it's very much meant to be accompanied, I think. You know.
Yes, and to hear the shouts or the laughter with each refrain.
To be enjoyed orally. You know.
Yes, and you can also see the way in which his own life as a rake, as a what is it, a picaroon or a piker, a low person involved in low things. You know, that's kind of echoed there. Well, this is one that is one of the last poems he ever he wrote. We know that it's late in his career that we know of because it's after his successful final appeal, you know, when they were going to execute him. And he basically crows. There's one other one where he praises the court, but this one I think is reflects his personality better than that last one. Although the last one must be borne in mind, because in the last one he praises the court, but in this one he crows and makes fun of the people who thought he was going to get killed. And it's titled, Now What Do You Think of My Appeal? Now what do you think of my appeal, Gagne? Was it really such a bad idea? Any beast will try to save its skin, and if in peril, trapped or trussed, will wriggle free if it can. So when, at one man's pleasure, I was sung that dire homily, was that the time to keep quiet? If I were an heir of Hugh Capet, himself the scion of butchers, they wouldn't have served me my drink through a cloth in that slaughterhouse, a cute little gag which you know well. But when that judicial misery was decreed for me unjustly, was that the time to keep quiet? Did you think that under my cap there's not enough philosophy to know how to say, I appeal? Well, there is, I can assure you, though only a fool would bet on it. When they said before the notary, you shall hang, I have to ask, Was that the time to keep quiet? My prince, if I'd had laryngitis, I'd have ended up where Clothar is, out in the field, upright, like a lookout. Was that the time to keep quiet? I think he refers there to having been, he would have been hung. But yeah, so he apparently just gets away with shit by being able to write to write letters.
Yeah.
And apparently carried himself through the world.
I mean, it's one thing to make a living by one's pen, but it's another thing entirely to live by one's pen, quite literally.
Yeah, like to save one's ass. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
actually that's a very, very short one that I do like. It's this is a bad. The original is something like "Je suis François, dont il me poit, né de Paris, en pré-pontois, et de la corde d'une trois, saurement colqué mon culpois." But and I apologize to anyone who understands. I just apologize to everyone who understands French. But the English translation, very loose and free because they wanted to keep a sense of rhyme. It goes. It's called the quatrain that Villon made when he was condemned to die. I am Francois, alack, alas, born in Paris, south of Arras, and from the 6-foot rope at last, my neck will learn the weight of my ass. So, yeah, he's a clever fellow.
Yeah,
and if anyone wants to know more about his life and his shenanigans that he got up to, definitely check out The Testament, which is it's the first verse of it is or stanza is in my 30th year of life, having drunk down all my shames, neither wholly fool nor wholly sane, despite the many pains I've known, every one of them received at the hands of Tybalt d'Alcigny, bishop he may be, out blessing the streets, but I swear he's no bishop to me. It begins like this and goes through his reproaches against all these people that have pissed him off, and his crowing about things he's succeeded in, and his remembering of ills that have been done to him. It's worth checking out. And now, Sir Panama Hat, over to you. It is yours.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to. I mean, the thing is, I can't give you one that tops Francois Villon, can I? Because there are a few people quite as good as that. I mean, I suppose I could cheat and say, well, Frederick the Great or something like that, who famously wrote poetry as he went into battle sometimes. But I won't. Well, first of all, I'd like to just have a bit of an interlude to respond to some things in chat. Somebody has brought up the South African Scottish poet Roy Campbell, who I would like to second that and highly recommend that people check him out. He was a very interesting man, and shall I say, somewhat sympathetic to our ideas, we might say. Quite a prominent supporter of Franco and various other causes of the 20th century, and also a very, very fine poet. Lots and lots of major poets of that period chalked him up as one of the best, but he's been his reputation has been trashed, and he's been totally forgotten because of his apparent political affiliations. Let's see what other people said. Yes, the Bullhead short story is the one I'm thinking of about the fictional book is called In Search of Al-Mutasim. Al-Mutasim, like an Arabic name. So who do we pick next? Well, I hope this doesn't bore people, but I would like to actually talk about Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, the kind of modernist bard of Lisbon, if you will.
And I know nothing of him, so I will listen and learn.
Well, the ironic thing is that he doesn't actually have much of a life I can talk about, but rather hit the way he kind of dealt with living a quiet life, but one that is almost entirely inward. So he's born in Lisbon to quite a well-to-do sort of upper class family, but he is he is actually taken to South Africa at a young age because his father died, his mother remarried. His stepfather is the Portuguese consul in Durban, which is in Natal in South Africa. And so he very early on develops this kind of weird cross-cultural intellectual life where he is partially reading in English, partially reading in Portuguese, and he also takes on all sorts of other languages. He gets Latin and Greek, and I think French as well, and a bit of German. And he's not an unpopular school kid. He does have friends, and he was a very, very brilliant student. But almost immediately, as soon as he's able to read and write, he prefers to spend time with himself rather than with others almost. And he begins to invent fictional personalities. The earliest of which, I think at age 9, maybe earlier, he creates a character called the Chevalier de Pas, who is this French nobleman and knight to whom he writes letters and then writes letters back to himself as the Chevalier. He does this a lot. He does this basically for the rest of his life. And as he gets older, he comes up with what he calls heteronyms, which are basically pen names. But rather than it just being a fake name, he invents entire backstories, and entire lives and entire styles of penmanship for these people. He prefers English names to Portuguese ones, it seems. So, and a lot some of them sound a bit clumsy in retrospect, but you get names like Charles Robert Anon or Alexander Search, or things like that. And he has things like one of them is Horace James Faber, things like this. And yes, as I said, very clever. He ends up back in Portugal in his teens. He, at the age of 21, he inherits his grandmother's very small fortune, and he immediately decides he's going to become a publisher. He has absolutely no talent for work of any sort. He's no practical experience with running a business or money or anything. So he starts up a small publishing company, and immediately it's in trouble, right? He hasn't got enough money to pay the bills. He can't get commissions. He can't do advertising. He can't network and get commissions for this press. So it fails more or less immediately, and he ends up in quite a bit of debt over that. But nevertheless, he basically sort of just retreats into the Portuguese Central Library. The Lisbon Central Library. Lives with his older female relatives, and writes. He writes lots of poetry. He becomes very interested in the new forms of literature around 1910, futurism and modernism and all this kind of thing, and helps found a literary magazine. He ends up becoming a part-time translator. He gets a job in a literary office of some sort. Publishes practically nothing in his own lifetime. And he is somewhat known to artistic circles because he's seen sort of, walking around fashionable bits of Lisbon. He's a bit of a flaneur, somebody who likes to sort of walk and be seen. But other than that, practically unknown. He would write poetry in different styles under different pen names. And he wrote everything from kind of unfinished novels to essays to philosophical works to personal reflections to poetry of all stripes. And rather than publishing them, he would write them on small scraps of paper and put them all in this gigantic trunk, a giant wooden trunk, which was in his bedroom, and it's still there now. And to this day, academics are still sorting through it and trying to piece everything together. The main work that came out of it is a book called The Book of Disquiet, which is like a sort of fragmentary philosophical work with lots of personal reflections. And he died in let me see. He died in 1935 at the age of 47, partially due to heavy drinking. He wrecked his liver, I think. He wasn't like a sort of raging alcoholic or anything, but he just drank too much. And he is. There's a recent biography by a guy called Robert Zenith, which talks about him. And he was a very, very kind of simultaneously fascinating, but also kind of totally invisible person. You know, he was like this obsessive inventing of other personalities. He almost never wrote as himself. He could only write as somebody else that was an extension of another person, if you see what I mean. Which is a rare thing to embrace. A lot of artists touch on that sort of thing, but they don't go all the way. But you know, he quite literally, you know, could only work under the assumed name of another person. And as I said, he would create entire lives for these people, you know, and some of the more popular ones with him went on for years. I think Alvaro de Campos is the one that he wrote under most, and he wrote kind of modernist poems and things like that. In fact, on my channel, I did a reading of a translation of one of his most famous poems, which is called "The Tobacconist," which is a kind of somewhat existential, sort of humorous poem about kind of happiness and mundanity and being stuck on a particular corner of a particular street. But yeah, it's difficult because I wanted to sort of challenge myself to see if I could sort of make him sound interesting, second-handedly, which I don't think I really can. But all I can say is that people should look into him. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting takes on what it is to be a poet, and you know, how to write, and you know, all that kind of stuff.
Is there any particular? Presumably, he wrote in Portuguese. Yes,
he did. And you can find excellent translations of all his stuff, brought out by major publishers. You can go on Amazon and buy, you know, the Pessoa's selected poems for only a few pounds or a few dollars. The Book of Disquiet has been translated a number of times. His work is new work from the big trunk, which contains over 25,000 different pieces of work. Is still being sorted. So there's always new stuff coming out, basically, from him. I don't know if people have heard of it, but there's a really funny novel from the 90s by a Belgian woman called Hygiene and the Assassin, which is about this kind of somewhat evil old author who spent like 10 years doing nothing but writing. And then he reveals towards the end of his life that for the last sort of 4 decades, he's just been bringing out materials from his drawers that he wrote years ago rather than writing new stuff, basically. I think that this may be the only real life case of that, is, you know, an author that wrote that much and kind of in that many fragments that even now, you know, new things are being pieced together and published, you know, nearly a century after his death. All from one place, one big trunk.
So he seems to fall very much into the rich inner life category, insofar as he created these whole contextual animals.
He is perhaps the ultimate example. I mean, he's basically imagine if Emily Dickinson had schizophrenia. I think that is
wow. That's saying something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And is there any? Are there any of his? Surely you have to share at least one of his poems.
Bear with me. Right? The book is actually slipped down under my desk. I need to reach down and grab it. One sec. Pardon me.
Take your time. It seems Cows is in the chat, indicating her endorsement. Pessoa mega based. He's someone that I myself had not heard of. You'll see, I don't know about these these politically incorrect poets do seem to fall into obscurity, or get locked up like Pound.
All right, I have the book. And while I was down there, I discovered the long lost copy of Gabriele D'Annunzio's Pleasure, which I was looking for. So that's something. That's a win.
Nice. Hidden under the desk.
Yeah, long lost under there. Let me see which one to read. I do wonder if to English ears these might sound a little bit mopey and a little bit too introspective. Perhaps it's this translation, but the one I'm looking for is called "The Keeper of Sheep," which is one of his most famous poems, I think, especially in Portuguese. Just give me a sec. It's not a very big book, so I just flick through and find it. Actually, no, I'm going to read you a bit from the tobacco shop because I really like it. So anyway, I'm going to read you one of the central sections from it. I won't read the whole thing. If you want to hear the whole thing, head over to my channel. But I'm just going to read you 3 middle stanzas from The Tobacconist. So, what do I know of what I shall be? I who don't know what I am. Be whatever I think? But I think so many things. And there are so many people thinking of being the same thing of which there cannot be all that many. Genius? At this moment, 100,000 brains are busy dreaming of themselves as geniuses, just like me. And history will not mark, who knows, even one. And nothing but manure will be left of so many future conquests. No, I don't believe in me. All the lunatic asylums have in them patients with many, many certainties. And I, who have no certainty at all, am more certain, or less certain. No, not even in me. In how many garrets and non-garrets in the world are there not at this hour geniuses in their own eyes dreaming? How many high and noble and lucid aspirations, yes, really and truly high and noble and lucid, and who knows whether realizable, will never see the light of the real sun or reach the ears of people. The world is for the person who is born to conquer it, and not for the one who dreams he can conquer it, even if he be right. I have dreamed more than Napoleon ever did. I have squeezed into a hypothetical breast more loving kindness than Christ. I have made philosophies in secret that no Kant could write down. But I am, and perhaps always shall be, the man of the garret, even though I don't live there. I shall always be the one who was not born for that. I shall always be the one who had qualities. I shall always be the one who waited for them to open to him the door at the foot of a wall without a door, and sang the ballad of the infinite in a hen coop, and heard the voice of God in a well with a lid. Believe in myself? No. And in nothing. Let nature pour out over my ardent head her sunshine, her rain, the wind that touches my hair, and the rest that may come if it will, or have to come, or may not. Heart-diseased slaves of the stars, we conquer the whole world before getting out of bed. But we wake up, and it's opaque. We get up, and it's alien. We go out of the house, and it is the entire Earth, plus the solar system, and the Milky Way, and the indefinite.
Very nice. I went along with it with one that I found online, and the translation was not quite as good and a good bit different, which just underscores the point that everybody listening must know if they don't know already.
I like that. I like that Pessoa embraces that kind of that fundamental anxiety of the artist of always that sort of that you can dream more than you can ever do. You know, that every work in your head is perfect. And it's almost too perfect to write them down, you know, or to paint them, or to give them realization, because in the realm of the imagination, everything is perfect, right? But when you bring it into the real world, it cannot be perfect.
Yeah, and particularly in my case, when I can actually hear a melody quite well, and then I'm like, oh, I'll just go ahead and hum it or whistle it or try to sing it, and it just comes out like a nightmare. Yeah.
But I also like Pessoa's sense of humor, and I think one of the problems is that um, a lot of the time in English translation, it loses some of the obvious irony it has in Portuguese, or this is what I'm told. Um, so some people read it and they go, "What is this? Pretentious existentialist introversion? This is blah 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 blah. Well, this is rubbish." Um, but they've missed, perhaps not through their own fault, the fact that it's you're meant to be kind of laughing along with this. The fact that he's a man lying there saying, like, why don't I just basically stay in my room and dream everything because it'd be better than going outside and confronting the world, sort of, where suddenly everything becomes imperfect. And I think that's partially why he was so keen on inventing all these personalities in his head and then writing as them. Because it was kind of a way of dealing with that fundamental question. And I think he's one of the few artists or philosophers to ever really grapple with that in that particular way. I also like how kind of self-flagellating it is.
Yeah, there's definitely that well, yes, there's I was just thinking back to like what is it in the Consolation of Philosophy, the way that he sets himself in the beginning as a sick man and his bed is surrounded by the muses, and reason comes and drives them out, and there's that internal dialogue, of the right path you should take, and these different characters in your inner world. He's definitely got that going on. They're just he spawns his own, it seems, much more than being in the tradition of taking them ready-made off the shelf. But I'm just scrolling down to other stuff in the tobacco shop where he's talking about if you're a Greek goddess conceived as a living statue, or a patrician woman of Rome, princess of the troubadours, 18th century marchioness, a famous courtesan. Yeah, he's just sort of reeling off these various shapes and forms, and some of them, to my previous point, do seem to be quite traditional. So it doesn't seem he wasn't familiar with it. It seems that he just wanted to play with it, and it's almost like combinatorics.
Constantly experimented in Latin and English forms of poetry. The thing is, like, he would write beautiful English sonnets under one name, and then do like Portuguese modernism under another. You see, and he was always referencing. I mean, that poem I just read you is clearly, I think, partially inspired by Shakespearean soliloquies. And he was an avid reader of Shakespeare, and he worked very hard to popularize English poetry in Portugal. And he believed in a cultural connection between the two countries.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the old idea of the Celts all sort of being along that Atlantic coast and then up into parts of the British Isles. It was only when I went to Galicia, right near Portugal, where, of course, they speak pretty much the same language. Just being on the different side of two international, on different sides of the border, but it's one group of people, and they're drinking beer and marching around playing bagpipes and shit. So yeah, there's definitely, or Brittany, where you've got people who are more closely related to the Welsh, I guess.
Yeah. I also love the bit about mental asylums are full of people with too many certainties, because one of my great philosophical beliefs is that rationalism is a dead end, that you cannot create systems with a human brain, with a human frame of understanding, or that within the human mind that answer all the questions. You can't do it. And the best philosophers are those that admit their uncertainty. And the entire project of religion, if you like, is to answer the uncertainty with uncertainty, I think. And I like Pessoa's firm declaration that to be full of doubts and uncertainties and insecurities is actually a healthier way to be, if you like, because if that mental patient wasn't sure if he was Napoleon, he wouldn't be as mad as the one, running around insisting that he is Napoleon, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and it's almost as though that willingness to suspend not only certainty but disbelief is what opens the gates for him that allows all these different characters to come marching in with their respective voices and views and indeed individual poems.
Yes, indeed.
Well, then that gives us a Portuguese inner life dweller. I'm trying to think. Do you have enough time to, for example, look at? I don't know. We could look at Shelley and Byron sort of as a pair because they're so closely intertwined.
Let's do that. You take us in on them.
Maybe do some closing thoughts after that on all of this. So do you have sufficient time for that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, feel free to jump in at any point here and fill this out, because I'm in no respect an expert on either of these men. I think they're interesting because they have the idea of rebellion. They have the idea of perhaps too much liberalism, ranging over into atheism and libertinage and the rest. And with Byron's poetry, I don't know it all that well, but there's certainly areas where there's he's clearly got a talent, no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
And Shelley, is very, very striking, and his poems made a strong impression on me. Byron, as I understand it, was someone who came from a noble family, but he was not at all expected to take the title. His father was a captain, described here in an essay by Northrop Frye, notable in himself as a literary critic.
Very interesting man himself.
Notable as I'm sorry, Captain Jack Burton, the father of the Lord Byron, George Gordon, was described by Frye as a psychopathic spendthrift and sponger on women, who had run through the fortunes of two heiresses, and so. The second of these heiresses was one, a Scotswoman, Catherine Gordon of Gight. Only in Scotland would you have a name Gight, Gight. What a name, Gight. And she is described as an explosive, unbalanced, ill-educated but affectionate woman whose only child was the poet. And so Byron was born in London in 1788. He was in poverty and distress as his mother was returning from France to Scotland to get some relief from her spouse. He had some kind of lameness, congenital, that had something to do with a leg being screwed up, but it's not entirely clear. It appears what was wrong with him, but he had it from birth. And apparently some sort of glandular imbalance that forced him to a starvation diet in order to avoid becoming, horribly fat. So he was brought up by his mother in Aberdeen, and he had a Presbyterian upbringing. And when he was 3, his father died. Then when he was 6, his cousin, who was heir to the title, was killed. And when he was 10, his great uncle, who held the title, died. And our poet became the 6th Lord Byron. And Frye here observes that the fact that Byron made so professional a job of being a lord is perhaps the result of his entering on that state when he was old enough to notice the difference his title made in the attitude that society took toward him. He went to Cambridge. He's educated at Harrow and at Trinity College. And he formed a number of friendships there. He got involved in a Whig club. And his chief athletic interests were swimming and pistol shooting. Apparently, when he was at Cambridge, he got around a regulation against keeping a dog by keeping a bear instead. And he's said to be quite extravagant, to have lacked discipline, and that he took a great liberties with his rank. And he apparently announced to the dons at Cambridge that he wished he'd gone to Oxford, which is I don't think something that you generally do.
Well,
but he got
it's something you say if you want to annoy them, certainly.
Yeah, he did obtain a classical education of a gentleman, as to be expected, and he started putting out volumes of lyrics fairly early on. And yeah, he then went off on a grand tour. This is really before he had made his name as a poet, and he went off to at first he went to Portugal and Spain. He bypassed Italy, and then by way of Malta, and then he went off to what were then Turkish dominions, Greece and Asia Minor, and he wanted to go to Albania as well. And you have to remember that the Peninsula War was going on at this time, so he was rolling all over the place when war was, across Europe, and yet he decided to travel to all these places. And this suggests to me that he was very likely a fucking spook. The Brits were very, very happy to send their aristocrats out to get involved in all kinds of things and to gather information.
At it again.
Now, I hate to say it, but it really, really seems he was. That's difficult. I have no other basis for that suspicion. That's just speculation. But yeah. So he did some stuff in Albania, got into some trouble with the local ruler there. Apparently some women might have been kidnapped and flung into the sea. He wrote a tale called the Giavur, which means the unbeliever, perhaps based on his own experiences there. He went to Greece. He went to Asia Minor, as I mentioned earlier in the stream. He swam across the Hellespont. And, he went to various ancient sites, and apparently was motivated by seeing Elgin going off with the marbles to write the Curse of Minerva.
Yes.
And he began to write a poem about his travels called Childe Harold, and he returned to England and took up a residence at some place called Newstead, apparently the estate of the Byrons. And then he began to a very, very successful literary and social career. Childe Harold basically made him famous very quickly, and he followed it with a series of Oriental tales, the Giavur, the Bride of Abydos, the Corsair, and Lara. It's all 1813, 1814. And this is worth noting. I'm sure Hat knows about this. Even I know this, and I don't know much about Byron, but he pumped out these enormous poems in record time.
Yeah.
And he said, I am like the tiger. If I miss my first spring, I go growling back to my jungle. There is no second. I can't correct. I can't, and I won't. And there's a line in Beppo where he says, I've half a mind to tumble down to prose, but verse is more in fashion. So here goes. And so it was popular at that time to read these vast, sprawling tales all in verse. And that seems to be what he specialized in. He
more or less, yeah.
And he had taken up his seat in the House of Lords. He was active in Whig circles. One of his first speech he made was in defense of frame breakers, or workers who had destroyed some textile machines through fear of unemployment. Based, something of that sort. Supported a number of other liberal causes, including the relief of Catholics in Ireland. He seemed to have a liking for Napoleon, which did not endear him to the rest of his aristocratic class.
Certainly wouldn't have, no.
Yeah, because that was all quite fresh in everyone's mind. So yeah, he got into any number of highly publicized affairs with all kinds of women. He eventually settled down with one and married her. It lasted about a year, and then they separated. They were too stylish to be divorced. But the Lady Byron got custody of the daughter. And so, yeah, all these scandals and, talking pro-French nonsense made him rather unwelcome. Or he certainly claimed that was the case. And he left for the continent in 1816, never to return to England. He spent some time in Geneva with Shelley and Shelley's, I guess you'd say, second wife, Mary Shelley. And he went over the Alps. He was in Venice for a while. And during that time, it was under the control of the Austrians. As I mentioned earlier in the stream, he was kept under surveillance by Austrian police. And he moved around Italy to a few different places. And then eventually he got contacted by some Greeks and decided he was going to go help with the Greek revolution, or the war to liberate Greece, the Greeks fighting against the Turks. And he went to Missolonghi and established contact with a prince there, one Alexander Mavrocordato, the leader of the Western Greek revolutionaries. And then his health broke down. It got all fucked up. I guess he was right around the age 36, and he died of a series of fevers, it appears. Shelley, I guess we should cover him as well very quickly. I have the biographical information here. I mean, if you want to just break it up, also if you wanted to do Shelley, we could do that, or I could run through it really quickly, and then we could just discuss the two of them together in their poems. What do you think?
Please go on.
Okay, well, Shelley, apparently, and I only learned a lot of this today because I'd never looked into his early life. Apparently, he was let's see here, is it Sussex, I want to say. So he came from a family of Sussex aristocrats going back to the 15th century. But his family, they weren't particularly artistic. They were, men of enterprise, and, he comes from a family with a seat in Parliament, safe assets, family connections, party influence. He was sent to Brentford, a private school, then to Eton and Oxford. And then he where is it? He was apparently someone with a sensitive nature, and also one who was very much a radical, believing in his absolute freedom. At sometimes proclaiming himself a Platonist, at other times an atheist, if I'm remembering all that correctly. And yeah, there's a great deal of radical thought running throughout his poems. What is it? Not surprisingly, at Eton, the young Shelley looked on some of its customs as forms of tyranny. And he wanted to get into scientific stuff, looked at the general principles of electricity and this sort of thing. But he studied Greek and Latin, as one does, and fooled around apparently with some sort of Gothic romance at the time. And then he went up to Oxford and apparently asked his dad to pull some strings for him to get some stuff published. And and his dad wasn't, paying much attention to what he was writing. But the publishing house were like, and they started. They published a few things, but it became very clear very quickly that Shelley was not going to behave as he would be expected to. He had a pamphlet, entitled "The Necessity of Atheism." And apparently shortly after it arrived at the booksellers, they were burning it in the back of the shop. Yeah. He was expelled from Oxford for refusing to answer questions with a friend of his about, their questionable behavior. they displayed they were expelled for displaying pride and obstinacy when called up to be questioned. And at that point, he was really in a shitty position. But he set his eyes on this one woman, Harriet Westbrook, and they were married. Even though Shelley was sort of against the idea, being a radical or a revolutionary, he regarded marriage as degrading, a concession to false social conventions. And then, shortly thereafter, he took up he had an acquaintance with William Godwin, author of Political Justice, who was himself a radical. And Shelley apparently got a real thing for Godwin's daughter, Mary Godwin, later known as Mary Shelley, of course. Indeed. The one who did the Frankenstein's monster book. And he did a philosophical allegorical poem called Queen Mab, but it was full of all kinds of statements like there is no God. So yeah, he talked about the existence of necessity. And yeah, that really kind of hammered against him socially in a way that you kind of saw with Byron as well. People were like, well, thank you, no. You're not only screwing around on your wife with this other woman, you're an atheist and you're a radical. So I think he where did he go next? Was it Switzerland? I can't.
Yes, it was just some sort of Central Western Europe. And I think did we cover the famous summer of 1816?
No, that's we're at it.
Right.
Visit to Lake Geneva, and he met Byron,
and
they all
Dr. Polidori
boating.
And that was 1816. It was the year without a summer, because there was a major volcanic eruption in Indonesia. I think what is now Indonesia.
Oh, that'd be Krakatoa.
I don't know if it was.
I think that was 1830s. Let me see.
Yeah, that was later on. I think 1816, year without a summer.
That was 1883. So yeah, a year.
Yeah. So this was the eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies. Largest eruption in 1,300 years.
Summer temperatures in Europe were the coldest of any day on record.
Yes.
For like from 1766 to the year 2000. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's right. There was snow on the ground in July in France. And of course, crops were completely ruined. So there was a lot, and of course, Europe is still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. So, Waterloo was only the previous year, so there's still a lot of disruption. Lots of infrastructure is torn up, and this just makes things worse. It wasn't so bad in Britain compared to the rest of the world, but there were these things called food or blood gangs, where basically poor people would go around in a big gang and they would storm food supplies to get food to feed themselves. The idea being that you would either die of starvation or die attempting to get food. So you would just, these people would fight like absolute savages to get to bread or whatever. Worst European famine of the 1800s, I think. So this is the setting in which Polidori, Shelley, Byron, and Mary are in seclusion at Lake Geneva. They seem very oblivious to all this. They don't actually mention this. I mean, I know news was a lot slower to travel back then, but still.
Well, you'd have to notice if there's snow on the ground in July, right?
Well, it's funny because Mary Shelley refers to it as that wet, ungenial summer, which is a perfect example of British understatement, I think, isn't it?
Also perhaps says something about how accustomed the Brits had become to just it's suffering. Yeah. Shitty
we don't
weather.
Really have summer here.
So yeah, at that point, apparently, his first wife Harriet appears to commit suicide, and then there is a legal decision by a Lord Chancellor to deprive Shelley of the care of the children.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, what did he write? He wrote Shelley wrote a letter saying, "I curse to the Lord Chancellor. I curse thee by a parent's outraged love, by hopes long cherished and too lately lost, by gentle feelings thou couldst never prove, by griefs which thy stern nature never crossed." So yeah, the following summer he writes some more poems, talking about the French Revolution, and it's let's see, a plea for liberty and justice. That's what it was. The poem looked blasphemous and immoral, so the publisher made him tone it down, and then it completely didn't sell. So he just split with Mary and their kids, both of whom died shortly thereafter, and he led a roving, restless, traveling existence. He got together with Byron at times. He was with Mary and this Claremont woman that tagged along, and then I think he ended up in Italy, I want to say.
Yeah, eventually.
And yeah, and he was there writing his various things, and you know, moving around to different sites in Italy, indulging his love of sailing. And then he ended up out at sea with a friend of his on a schooner that had been built for them, and the whole thing wrecked, and his body was found drowned on shore some days later with a volume of Keats's poems in his pocket. They apparently got hit by a storm while out at sea, and yeah, and he and thus a period was put to his existence. And so that's the basic background. I'm sure there's plenty I'm missing. I'm no expert on either of these guys, any stretch of the imagination, but that gives you a background. Both of them in their own ways being disinclined to go with the flow. Both of them have enough in terms of resources, their own personal resources, to kind of do the wandering aristocrat thing. And yeah, they more Byron seems to me to be someone much more just sort of inclined to throw conventions by the wayside because of his nature, whereas with Shelley it seemed to be a matter of like revolutionary principles and utopian thinking. Shelley's politics, don't really interest me very much, but this is one of those cases where his gifts as a poet are sufficient for me to overlook all that.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. The kind of, at this point, very cliche kind of liberal, romantic, revolutionary stuff doesn't really have much appeal to me. And I think it smacks of basically kind of, privileged elites, sort of aristocratic Peter Panism, I suppose, But yes, I mean, undoubtedly one of the great poets. We don't even really need to sort of puff his reputation at all, do we? I mean, it goes without saying. Absolutely deserving of his place in the canon. I mean, there's a wealth of things I could read from to back that up, What's a good Shelley?
Oh, well, I mean, the classics, I almost don't want to read them because they're so well known, Ozymandias, or the Ode to the West Wind. There were a couple I found here.
I always quite like doing bits from Adonai.
Well, please do.
I used to know some off by heart. I could. All right, hang on. I can do a bit of it off by heart.
And can you give people a context for this with Keats and everything, so they know what it's about?
Yes. It's basically John Keats died as a very young man, and all the other poets basically were deeply upset over this because he was kind of the broad star of that generation, if not in personality, then certainly in the sheer beauty of his verse. People always argue about the pronunciation. I had a literature teacher who was a classicist who insisted it was Adonai, but a lot of British people say Adonis. And there is some confusion. I've heard academics argue over it. I suppose. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I'll say. I don't know which one.
I see. There's a footnote in my edition here that says the Adonai was a festival celebrating the death and resurrection of Adonis. So
right. So
yeah. So it sounds like you Adonis.
Adonis then? Okay.
Yeah, because they specify the Adonai without an S at the end.
I don't know. Okay,
So,
well, I've just looked up an objective source to settle this. It's and they're pronouncing it Adonais.
well, there it is.
Adonais. So I forgive the excesses of an old teacher. So here we go. I'll do the first. I think I can get the first 2 or 3. I weep for Adonais, he is dead. Oh, weep for Adonais, though our tears thaw not the frost which binds so dear a head. And thou, sad hour, selected from all years to mourn our loss, rouse thy obscure compeers, and teach them thine own sorrow. Say, with me died Adonais, till the future dares forget the past. His fate and fame shall be an echo and a light unto eternity. Where wert thou, mighty mother, when thy son lay, pierced by the shaft which flies in darkness? Where was lorn Uraniah when Adonais died? With veiled eyes, mid listening echoes, in her paradise she sate, while one with soft enamored breath rekindled all the fading melodies, with which, like flowers that mock the corse beneath, he has adorned and hid the coming bulk of death. I'm going to stop there because I can do the next 2 lines, but I can't think of any after that. But I'll get the text up anyway because it's worth reading. I'll do a few more. I've got the text here now. Oh, weep for Adonais, he is dead. Wake, melancholy mother, wake and weep. Yet wherefore? Quench within their burning bed thy fiery tears, and let thy loud heart keep like his, a mute and uncomplaining sleep, for he is gone, where all things wise and fair descend. Oh, dream not that the amorous deep will yet restore him to the vital air. Death feeds on his mute voice and laughs at our despair.
Is that where you've chosen to stop?
Well, I want to do a few from the end, but I was just sort of letting that sink because I mean, has any poetry, perhaps since Geoffrey Hill, arguably, been written with that level of power to it?
Oh, he's a beast, man. He's an absolute beast.
And the thing is, the real finishing touch skill, the perfection of a great poet is being able to make it all sound effortless. Totally effortless,
Oh yeah, there are none of those weird jagged closing words to force a rhyme.
It just flies. It just flies. Right, I'll do the last 3. Why linger? Why turn back? Why shrink, my heart? Thy hopes are gone before. From all things here they have departed. Thou shouldst now depart. A light is passed from the revolving year, and man and woman, and what still is dear attracts to crush, repels to make thee wither. The soft sky smiles, the low wind whispers near. 'Tis Adonais calls. Oh, hasten thither. No more let life divide what death can join together. That light whose smile kindles the universe, that beauty in which all things work and move, that benediction which the eclipsing curse of birth can quench not, that sustaining love which through the web of being blindly wove by man and beast and earth and air and sea burns bright or dim, as each are mirrors of the fire for which all thirst, now beams on me, consuming the last clouds of cold mortality. The breath, whose might I have invoked in song, descends on me. My spirit's bark is driven far from the shore, far from the trembling throng whose sails were never to the tempest given. The massy earth and sphered skies are riven. I am borne darkly, fearfully, afar, whilst burning through the inmost veil of heaven, the soul of Adonais like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are.
He always just comes back around so neatly.
I know.
It's all so smooth. There's one here that I rather like. It's called Circumstance, and this is possibly from 1821, and as follows: Circumstance. A man who was about to hang himself, finding a purse, then threw away his rope. The owner, coming to reclaim his pelf, the halter found and used it. So is hope, changed for despair, one laid upon the shelf. We take the other, under heaven's high cope. Fortune is God. All you endure and do depends on circumstance as much as you. So he certainly isn't crying out to God there.
No, but the perfect just compunction of those words, just the it just to appreciate the difficulty and the skill that it takes to put something together like that. You can't fluke it. It doesn't come easy.
There's one here called, it's very, very short. It's another one. I can't read from, Prometheus Unbound is just so damn long, and the other well-known short ones, we already mentioned. This one's called To the Moon. Art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless among the stars that have a different birth, and ever changing like a joyless eye that finds no object worth its constant sigh? Yeah, that one's screwed up by pronunciation. And ever changing like a joyless eye that finds no object worth its constant sigh.
Yes, that's right. Something like that.
Yeah, I can't even begin to do it.
It's like trying to read the Shakespeare sonnets, where you always have to keep in mind the original pronunciation.
Which I scarcely would even begin to grasp. Now, here's the challenge. The hell do you read from Byron? I mean, all I can think of is examples of what his verses like, because they're all so damn long, Yeah. They're massive rolling things. I mean, I don't know if, a lot of it is acts, many cantos.
I'll read one of the ones that really captured my imagination at school when I was getting into poetry, which is She Walks in Beauty. Very, very famous. But, she walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which wades in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face. Where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place, and on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent.
Very nice. And here's one from one of his shorter ones. This is So we'll go no more a roving. So we'll go no more a roving, so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving, and the moon be still as bright. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul wears out its breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself have rest. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go no more a roving by the light of the moon. And these are really, they're his lyricism, his skill with language is there. I don't think he had a gift that was equal to Shelley's, but it's very smooth. And
Byron had a very specific conception of the balanced line. A lot of his lines seem to split into two parts. And there's actually a letter that I was reading some more Clive James essays on poetry, and he brings this up. He was writing a letter to, I don't think who it was, and he talked about the balancing of syllables in a line. And I must bear with me a moment because I'm going to try and find it. Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, I'll give them just a quick bit. What is this from? It's from Don Juan. It's just a sample of how there's a sort of more yeoman-like poetry that he delivers at length. That is straightforward enough that it doesn't that it suits itself to the sense. And doesn't wear you out trying to keep up with it as you read a very, very long piece. This is a bit. It's just a few of these verses from the first canto of Don Juan. But I'm not starting with the very first one. I'll just read two here very quickly while Hat is pulling this stuff up. Nelson was once Britannia's god of war, and still should be so, but the tide has turned. There's no more to be said of Trafalgar. 'Tis with our hero quietly inurned, because the army's grown more popular, at which the naval people are concerned. Besides, the prince is all for the land service, forgetting Duncan, Nelson, Hull, and Jervis. Brave men were living before Agamemnon, and since exceeding valorous and sage, a good deal like him too, though quite the same, none. But then they shone not on the poet's page, and so have been forgotten. I condemn none, but can't find any in the present age fit for my poem, that is, for my new one. So as I said, I'll take my friend Don Juan. Yeah, I'm screwing this up because there are details of the pronunciation to make it roll, and I cannot command them. But did you find your bit, Mr. Hat?
I'm just getting it up now. I've got a very roundabout way of looking for it, but
all right. Well,
yeah. I mean, obviously, Don Juan was a favorite.
Yeah, except I really, really didn't do it justice at all. Here's a very short one called Stanzas for Music, published in 1816. There be none of beauty's daughters with a magic like thee, and like music on the waters is thy sweet voice to me, when, as if its sound were causing the charmed ocean's pausing, the waves lie still and gleaming, and the lulled winds seem dreaming, and the midnight moon is weaving her bright chain o'er the deep, whose breast is gently heaving as an infant's asleep. So the spirit bows before thee to listen and adore thee, with a full but soft emotion, like the swell of summer's ocean. I mean, he's good, and to be fair, there really is he's not as good as Shelley, but there is something. There's a they seem to be on a similar wavelength of lyricism in their time, you know. Anyway, how goes it now, Mr. Hat?
I think I've just got it. It's only a very minor point, but I'm desperate to find it because it's good.
To make it proper.
Here we go. So
activate autism.
So yes, I had to download an EPUB of a book I have on the shelf in the house, and then trawl through it to find this thing, and that didn't work, but I found one anyway. So he was writing a letter to somebody about composing poetry, and he was talking about balancing syllables, and this tells us a lot about why Byron's poems sound the way they do, with that kind of divide in the middle of each line that balances each out on each side. And he drafted a verse that sounded something like this: a king who cannot, a prince of Wales who doesn't, patriots who shall not, and ministers who will not. That was the original line, and he condensed this to the following verse, which is, he was talking about Britain in 1814, and he was taking a very dim view of it, and he said, "'Tis said indifference marks the present time, then hear the reason, though 'tis told in rhyme. A king who can't, a prince of Wales who don't, patriots who shan't, and ministers who won't. What matters who are in or out of the place, the mad, the bad, the useless, or the base?" So I think Shelley was more of a kind of, he wanted that kind of running, singing rhythm that kind of picks up in intensity as you go. Byron was more of a kind of a technical maestro, if you like, who was always looking at those lines and messing about with syllables and placing a word here or there just to balance it that slight bit more. I think certainly more of a technical poet than Shelley, who was more of a kind of performative poet, I think.
And there's definitely an aspect. There's a thing with hemiola, which, if I remember correctly, is in music, where you've got sort of an opening or a stage setting or a building of tension in a first part answered by a second part that resolves the phrase. Mm-hmm. And you can certainly feel that in that second sample that you just read, where he closes it. And you can see that done very artfully with G.K. Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse, where he gets this rolling thing. About, right? Yeah. And he just kind of loops back 2 times and stitches it closed with like a rolling ending. And it's just like, pow! Like everything's been built up, and then it resolves very, very nicely. I don't think anyone's quite done that like Chesterton has. That's still, no, not quite. I'm not supposed to be talking about Chesterton here, but that poem still, like, it'll make me jump up and down, like you want to climb up on a table and shout it. It's very, very, very powerful. Well, I don't know that I don't know that we did justice to these two, but certainly in their their poetry's out there for. They can do justice to themselves if people simply, put forth the effort to read any of it. But we certainly do see in their lives the classic idea of the poet as, at least in Shelley's case, as the, person with deep social concerns. Byron had it, I mean, in his own way, but it was more like, go out there in the world and get involved in the war, so to speak. Whereas with Shelley, it was more like, bring down this vision of the future, topple the idols, and, we can all be free from these bonds, the bonds that, we can free ourselves and no longer be hidebound by all these traditions, things like marriage, concern for a deity, and, whether we measure up. So there is the theme there of the revolutionary. There's certainly the theme of the subversive. I can certainly see why, someone who was running a republic would want to have Shelley removed from it, and certainly Byron as well, in terms of being, you could certainly see the charge of corrupting the morals of the youth of Athens being laid at the feet of Byron.
Yes, definitely.
So we do see certain patterns also, to take it back to Ovid, who apparently pissed off Augustus and got sent off to some shitty Black Sea colony.
Could we round off the evening by talking about the classic poetic biography, The Exile of Ovid? Can we sort of bring an end to it with that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to carry it forward? I mean, there's not a great deal of information about it. I've got what's
that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, I've got what's in the, I don't have the latest edition, but I've got, one of the last 2 or 3 of the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which has a bit on it.
So, as some people will know, Ovid, or Ovid, depending on your pronunciation, was a Latin poet who is ranked as basically the great 3, along with Virgil and Horace, who I think were both older than he was, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and given this time frame, was he another one who was under the wing of Mecanas?
I'm not sure, actually.
Well, it's certainly the period. It's certainly the period of Augustus when Mecanas was promoting these poets. I can't remember if Ovid was one of them, but this is certainly it's like it's a very similar thing to the 3 Crowns of Florence when you talk about these guys that Panama Hat mentioned here. It's like talking about Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante. These are the ones of the great dawning of the imperial age.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, Ovid wrote a lot about his own life, more so than most other poets, and he was of great biographical interest to Quintilian, Seneca the Elder, that is. So we know quite a lot about him. We know about his early life to quite a well-to-do family, born in what is now Sulmo. That is in the south of Italy, isn't it? It's modern day Sulmona. It's in the Abruzzo anyway. I can't quite remember where that is, but anyway.
Sorry, I was just pulling it up in my book.
No
what
worries.
does it say here? Yeah, Sulmo in the Abruzzi. So yeah, who the hell? Let me look up Abruzzi while you go on.
Should know this probably. But yes, his father wanted him to be a lawyer.
Central Italy.
Central Italy. Okay. His father wanted him to be a lawyer and provided a very expensive education for him. He was schooled at the famous rhetoric schools of Aurelius Fuscus and Porcius Latro, who were kind of the great rhetoricians, the great speakers, the great teachers of their day. But Ovid, fairly early on, decided that he wanted to be a poet, and he actually argued with his teachers at the schools, because obviously in traditional rhetoric you have the poles, and he wanted to exclusively work in the emotional pole, not the argumentative pole. So he was more interested in the kind of emotional and sensory side of rhetoric than the kind of logical and argumentative one. And he eventually gives up law in his late teens, and he goes on some travels. He goes to Greece, sees Asia Minor and southern Italy.
And that's his version. That's his version of the Grand Tour, which should be familiar to the Brits as well.
As a kind of well-educated, sort of wealthy young man, going on a tour to see all these places in the empire. He briefly holds public office, sort of minor administrative posts in the empire, and in one of the courts in Rome, I think.
And very quickly, I discovered that he's not backed by Mecanas. Apparently, his backer was one M. Valerius Messala Corvinus. So he was not part of the Mecanas coterie. Sorry, go on.
Yes, but he did find a patron around the age of 20, I think, who you mentioned was Corvinus, who was, I believe, a military figure and basically a kind of like art collector and general patron. He was basically a very rich man who liked to fund artists and poets and such. He becomes friends with famous poets of the day. He meets Horace and Propertius and all this. And he apparently did meet Virgil, but Virgil, I think, was much older and was probably towards the end of his life by then. He became famous for kind of some strange sort of sexual and love quirks. He had apparently, according to Seneca, Ovid was married 3 times and had divorced twice by the time he was 30, which is pretty impressive now, and it's pretty impressive even then. So and he did have some children apparently, and many of his wives were kind of noble Roman women. And he became basically quite a well-known elegiac poet. He, of course, famously writes the Amours, which is the love poems or erotic poems addressed to a woman called Carina, who may or may not have been basically a fictional point on which to address the work. There's lots and lots of sort of celebrations of sex and of physical beauty. He writes next on love. He does the Ars Amatoria. He also starts writing about kind of love seduction, but also starts writing about kind of political things. He starts to insert political themes into his work. Not entirely clear why, but given his position in society, it's possible he was, beginning to mix in kind of different political camps. And he also became a very celebrated poet in general, very well known, very very popular. And he wrote then the Metamorphosis, which is, I think, his most famous work probably, and considered his greatest work, which is basically a kind of history of the Roman world over the course of many different smaller poems. And he's became obsessed with the idea of transformation, of people being transformed into things or from things. And then in 8 AD, he's banished to Tomis, which is now the city of Constanta in Romania, on the Black Sea. The Emperor Augustus intervened personally to exile Ovid without any legal confirmation from a judge or the Senate, because it was the age of the first emperor, I suppose, not long after the death of Caesar, I think. And him and some of his family members apparently were banished. It's not clear why. Ovid himself alludes to it by saying it was something to do with carmen et error, which translates as a poem and a mistake. So it's possible that he wrote a poem that caused an uproar and then possibly did something else. Some historians theorize it was to do with the Julian marriage laws, which basically promoted monogamy because they were trying to increase the Roman birth rate, and they figured that monogamy was the best way to do that. But the thing is that Ovid was known because he writes in support of monogamy in his work. So, or at least he appears to it, but it's not wholly clear. But anyway, the point is he's banished from Rome, ends up in what is basically a half civilized outpost of the empire, full of
shithole.
Basically full of indigent people who don't speak much Latin. It's barely Hellenized, which was the term that the Romans would have used. He is quite depressed over this. He keeps hoping he'll be allowed back, but nevertheless is not, and he ends up dying there. He writes a few things there, I think, and some scholars actually claim that the exile is fictional; it never happened, and it was some kind of literary thing. But that's not something we don't have the time or the expertise, I think, to get into that just now.
Yeah, I certainly But for what it's worth, it's not even touched upon in the Oxford, summary, the classical dictionary.
It's a fringe theory among some academics, basically.
All right. In terms of, there's no telling, the guess they make here is that it's some scandal that affected the imperial house, and that it was possibly an involuntary complicity. But he's one of the most popular poets in Rome, and he's begging to be let back. And Augustus, nor later Tiberius, would let him back. So 9 years after he's banished to this shithole, he dies there. So it sounds a little bit more than involuntarily being a part of something. But you definitely have the sort of fundamental tradition that we see in later ages of, people paying the price. Now, I don't suppose that it was that Shelley and Byron would not be allowed ever to return, but they certainly ended up being pushed out of polite society for sure. And if not properly banished, they had to find a new place to be. So we definitely have the theme of poets not being able to keep their damn mouth shut.
Yes.
and pissing off people in power based on what they said, that's a persistent theme across history as well.
Very much so. Very much so.
Do you have any examples of any of his work to share? I have a very small one from The Art of Love.
You go on. I want to find one that was translated in the Elizabethan era into quite a nice rhyme, which I'll look for.
Well, this is a modern one. What is this? Translated by Rolf Humphreys. When is this from? It's got to be
Wonderful
1950s, maybe 60s. What is this?
Rolf Humphreys. Yeah.
I bought this when it's still got the receipt in it, and it's making a lignin stain on my pages. I bought this when I was living out in Berkeley. What is this? 1957. It's this is from The Art of Love, which has all kinds of crazy and certainly pretty wild by moral standards from many periods of our history. You'd expect the Romans to be kind of fast and loose with all of this. Yeah. So this is just a short one about the castrated chaperone that's in charge of keeping an eye on women to make sure that they don't arrange their own little trysts. And he writes, "Poor castrate chaperone, I suffer too, since you, who guard the lady, cannot have the joys of love. The man who altered you deserved himself to take the wounds he gave. You would be more compliant to my pleading if love for woman ever made you hot, unfit for warlike spear or feats of riding, what all or most men have, those you have not. So fetch and carry for her, be a bar to youth and beauty's amorous intent. She still could fool you, nuisance though you are. What two have willed lacks not accomplishment. Since nothing can be lost by courtesies, pro tempore, I'm asking, Mr. Please." So he seems to be addressing himself to the eunuch to allow him to just get on with it and get away with it. But there's there's plenty of that sort of thing. He talks about various great beauties from the past and just discusses all these various ways that love carries you in first one direction and in another. It's important to point out here that for someone like this coming from this tradition, and not all that much less so for many later poets, it was important that he had a command of the mythology and all the traditions. And so what makes Ovid stand out quite a bit is not only his skill as a poet, which is somewhat opaque to me because I've never studied Latin, but also his command of all the traditions, all the mythology, and all the classics. There are many of the stories from mythology that survive today really just because of Ovid. The Metamorphoses is just packed with mythology, some of which doesn't survive anywhere else, but is certainly a part of the great tradition. And Ovid was so knowledgeable about it that he captured and preserved it.
Yes. Well, I'd like to read a particularly vicious part of the Amores, which is the fifth elegy from Book 1. Quite a famous one. Many sort of Elizabethan romantics translated it into rhyme and kind of toned down the more overtly sexual aspects. But this is a more modern translation. It's not rhymed, and it's called Corina in an Afternoon. Lots of translators call it the siesta or the midday poem because it's kind of set during a kind of relaxing period at the heat of the Italian day. And it's not very long, but I'll read it for you now. It was hot, and the noon hour had gone by. I was relaxed, limbs spread in the midst of the bed. One half of the window was open, the other closed. The light was just as it often is in the woods. It glimmered like Phoebus dying at twilight, or when night goes, but day has still not risen. Such a light as is offered to modest girls, whose timid shyness hopes for a refuge. Behold, Corina comes, hidden by her loose slip, scattered hair covering her white throat, like the famous Semiramis going to bed, one might say, or Laius loved by many men. I pulled her slip away, not harming its thinness much, yet she still struggled to be covered by that slip. While she would struggle so, it was as if she could not win. Yielding, she was effortlessly conquered. When she stood before my eyes, the clothing set aside, there was never a flaw in all her body. What shoulders, what arms I saw and touched. Breasts formed as if they were made for pressing. How flat the belly beneath the slender waist. What flanks, what form, what young thighs. Why recall each aspect? I saw nothing lacking praise, and I hugged her naked body against mine. Who doesn't know the story? Weary, we both rested. May such afternoons often come for me.
Yeah, amen.
I had a
pressing.
feeling you'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's not the only feeling I had. Yes. Indeed, the power, the flatness of the belly. Yes. He clearly was someone, yeah. I mean, it's that was a time when in Rome, the heart of the world itself, the navel of the world at that point, when one would be expected to know these things about love. There's also his Fasti, which I quote from on occasion, which is a poem related to the calendar. And again, it shows the breadth of his knowledge of mythology. I definitely recommend all of his poetry. Because it's interesting both for how it's written, but also what it contains, as I mentioned before, that doesn't survive anywhere else. So yes, since we've crossed the 3-hour mark, would you be up now, Hat, for sort of looking at what we've seen here with these different lives, if there are any patterns?
Well, I think. Perhaps one thing I would add to my initial thesis, if we will, is that I think the intensity of personality has to be there. I mean, I know I said that T.S. Eliot was seen as, oddly empty by some of his British contemporaries when he first moved to the UK. But I do think that clearly there is a will to understand or to propagate or to express that leads somebody to really want to make good poetry. And you really have to want it, There is with all these people, there is clearly something that puts them above, I think, the average, what we would call normies, that allows you to tap into that particular energy, and that particular spirit or will, which allows you to express things in such a way, because there is such a thing as pretty but somewhat empty verse, and I don't think any of what we've read can be called that at all. It's perfect blend of kind of verbal music and kind of metaphysical substance, really.
Or at least meaning that doesn't make you feel as though you've wasted your time. Though probably the least deep of them is that we looked at so far is probably Byron in some of his spots, but that's maybe not an entirely fair assessment. It does seem that there's definitely a strong inner life. I was going to say that there's the idea of outer experience that you can draw on, or inner experience. But I think it's probably, now having gone through this with you, it's probably safer to say that regardless of the outer life, it's the primary, the strength of the inner life and the inner vision that is the element that you can't get rid of, because we've seen that you can basically be a shut-in and deliver amazing poems, which means that you've got the inner life there. Whereas, and we also see with people who go out in the world that there are plenty of people who are great adventurers and all the rest, and who never would have been a poet. So still, it seems like it's the inner experience of even the outer thing. So it's, reflected in a glass, as the metaphor goes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we more or less prove what we set out with. I mean, it's just a wonderful excuse to sit and read some poetry, isn't it? Really, that's what it's been for me.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Talk about poets,
and to learn about some new ones that I had never heard of that you brought up, particularly this Portuguese guy.
It's a shame we didn't get onto Dylan Thomas, because that would have been interesting.
That would have uncracked the great vault of you'd have to start talking like this, whatever that Welsh voice that you do.
No, that's not Dylan Thomas wasn't AA. He didn't sound like that,
And we did, I've already been in fights with you and D. I'm surprised that you're even willing to appear on my channel, because I made fun of the voice.
That's not what he's doing.
The recitation.
That's not. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day, I think.
That's an opportunity for you to smack me with a stick. Yes. I think it definitely was a great opportunity to just roll through and look at some of these different figures from the past, and hopefully people will have pulled some bits out. I mean, people who are into poetry, I don't think I think the one that they most likely wouldn't have heard of would have been your Portuguese poet. But the rest of them obviously are very, very well known. Everybody's probably heard of most of them. But hopefully this will spur you all to take a look at it again, and to engage, as it were, to read it, to consume and digest it, make it a part of yourself. Maybe even pick a few of them and commit them to memory, and then you can carry them in your pocket with you always.
Absolutely. But it's a wonderful pastime, even, or just a mental exercise. Learn a poem a week or something. That's something that I used to do a lot. I need to start doing it again, really. But making it a regular thing.
Yes. And and if you combine it with stuff with Shakespeare, for example, I have to go through and go back to that. Of course, they're plays, but it's a brilliant poetry as well. So if you're not so much into straight poems, but you want to understand all the elements that go into it regardless, but in the context of a broader story, then, you know, you could go to Shakespeare, you could go to, you know, even to somebody like a Johnson or a Marlowe, you can go to, or to a Byron later on, as we talked about with the longer stories. Or if you want it to be almost like a allegorical, metaphorical, philosophical tract that just runs on and on, but with, you know, beautiful heights, then read Shelley's longer stuff.
Absolutely.
So, yes. Well, then, do you have anything coming up these days? You have any other streams that you plan to do in the in future? Hat, any other things? Remember that people who were not here at the beginning, they can be shilled at a second time, and I will not steal your shill thunder here. Is there anything you want to point people to?
Only to my channel. Keep an eye out for Saturday. I'll be appearing on Nathan CJ Hood's channel to talk about Wagner and total art. And there will be so many things coming up the end of this year that I can't talk about yet. That's basically it.
Excellent. Well, we will await these developments with a keen interest. For my part, I have a stream coming up next Thursday. I believe it's going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern, I want to say. I'm going to be talking to someone whose name, I'm sorry to say, I cannot at present remember. I got connected to him on Twitter because he's into MMA and fighting and all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to talk to him about lessons from dance and dance training that might be able to be applied to fighting. So that, if nothing else, will be an interesting angle on all of that you don't often hear about, despite the fact that you have people like Lomachenko, who has a dance background, and it clearly made him a much better fighter. So I'm not claiming to be any kind of a fighter, but I've studied that a bit. And so, yeah, I'm going to hopefully throw some new angles of approach on the fighting thing by considering dance against that background. There is in the works a stream that I hope to be doing in the near future with Philosophicat about reincarnation and different ideas surrounding that. Just have not scheduled that yet. Otherwise, I should tell everybody, look down in the description box below, and you will find links for Panama Hat's Twitter and for his YouTube channel. And your books are available on, your poetry is available on Amazon, is it not?
It is indeed. And there will be more coming, hopefully, very soon.
Yeah, if you don't mind, if you could shoot me a link when we're done with this to your books, and I'll add them to the description so people can get to that quickly. Well, then, thank you very, very much. Anything else you want to cover?
No, I think that's all for tonight. Thanks to everyone for listening, and thank you very much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. And I just remembered we mentioned Boethius and the constellation of philosophy in this. We need to talk about Confederacy of Dunces soon, don't we?
Oh yes, I need to get my damn copy of that. I might just have to read it.
Oh my god,
my valve is stuck. Yes,
my valves.
So, Ignatius Riley, and who's that black guy with the dark glasses?
Jones.
Jones, that's it. Yes.
Whoa.
It's, and Myrna, doesn't he have the girlfriend Myrna who gets all involved?
Minkoff.
With
Yep. Myrna Minkoff. Yeah.
Yeah, we do need to do that. Let's do that soon.
The modern world is too much lacking in proper theology and geometry.
Yes,
we need to do it soon. Do you think we could get Charlemagne to join us, given that he is actually a New Orleanian?
But my family's New Orleanian on both sides.
Oh, well,
but you can try. Let's check with him and see if he's actually read it. And if not, get the dirtbag to read it. It'll be good for him anyway.
Indeed.
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so yeah, shoot me a link with your poetry. I'll add it, and we'll get something in the works for Confederacy of Dunces. Thanks very much, Panama Hat. The pleasure is mine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. I appreciate everybody who stuck it out. Hopefully, you at least found yourself entertained for a bit. I thank you all. Until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.